The boy stood among the tall trees in the dense forest, swinging his sword confidently, practicing every stroke and movement with exceptional precision. The sun's rays shone through the trees, illuminating his concentrated face. Every movement was calibrated, every swing of his sword the result of long hours of hard training. Finally, feeling tired and satisfied with his completed training, he took a deep breath. It was time to return home so as not to be late for breakfast. When the boy entered the small cozy house, he was greeted by the warm aroma of freshly cooked food. In the corner of the room sat his grandmother, a woman of advanced years, but with a clear and kind look. He said hello to her and she, with a smile on her face, served him his breakfast. It was their morning ritual, which they both loved. After a delicious breakfast, the boy gratefully put the dishes aside. He declared that he needed to change and get ready so that he wouldn't be late for an important event. The grandmother, sighing, regretfully realized that it was indeed time for him to go. She remembered that he had already turned 15, which meant that it was time for his coming-of-age ceremony. While the boy was changing his clothes, his grandmother said with a note of sadness in her voice that his parents would not be able to see this important moment in their son's life. They were famous adventurers who had reached the platinum rank. However, after that, they disappeared without a trace while fulfilling their first mission. Grandmother wept as she remembered how her husband, his dear grandfather, had left them so early. Her heart squeezed at the memories and tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. She sighed, looking at Rolf with gratitude. Her thoughts drifted back to the past, to the times when his grandfather had been around and how hard it was for her to accept his loss. Rolf stood beside his grandmother in the cozy living room full of old photographs and crocheted doilies. His grandmother's words echoed in his heart, and he felt better. He took her hand gently, feeling the depth of her gratitude and sadness mixed with pride in him. Rolf always felt that he had done what he was supposed to do, for family meant everything to him. Rolf, pulling on his best clothes, confidently declared that he too would reach the platinum rank and earn a lot of money so that his grandmother could enjoy life. He firmly believed that by becoming an adventurer, he would be able to find his parents and bring them home so that they could be together again. His grandmother, with warmth in her eyes, thanked Rolf for his words and said that his parents would be proud of him. She added that she believed in his abilities and that he would definitely get a good skill that would help him in his aspirations. Rolf, after saying goodbye to his grandmother, kissed her on the cheek and told her that he had to go now. He left the house and headed towards the huge building that towered over the village. This place was well known to all the residents. It was where the coming-of-age ceremony was held. Along the way, he saw many teenagers his age, who were animatedly discussing what skill they wanted to learn. Some dreamed of becoming swordsmen and obtaining the sword peak skill, while others aspired to obtain the vessel of magic and join the group of golden lions. However, one of the guys remarked that such skills were only given to the strongest, and not everyone would be able to get into this elite group. Suddenly, everyone gathered for the ceremony was asked to pay attention. An old man in a black cloak, with an ancient and wise expression, walked up to the altar and raised his hands. He solemnly announced that in the name of the goddess Dovalis, the talents bestowed upon everyone present would now be revealed. The old man asked everyone to line up and one by one approach the altar to find out what gift they would receive. Rolf, standing among the other teenagers, felt excited and impatient. His heart beat faster, and he thought about how this moment would change his life forever. Because of his short stature, Rolf couldn't see what was happening ahead in the queue. He only heard the old man announce that one of the teenagers had obtained the skill of an archer. The noise and chatter around him grew, and Rolf noticed other teenagers sharing their new skills. One of them loudly announced that he had the counting skill and would apparently be a merchant. This opened Rolf's eyes to the variety of skills that existed. Rolf wondered what skill he would get. He dreamed of a swordsman's skill like his father's or a strong body like his mother's. The boy hoped to gain a skill that would be useful in reaching the platinum rank like his parents. These thoughts kept him busy as he stood waiting for his turn. Suddenly, the old man announced that it was Rolf of Agdara's turn and asked him to come over. The boy's heart beat faster as he approached the magic ball and placed his hand on it. Suddenly, an inscription popped up on the surface of the ball stating that he had obtained the recovery skill. Rolf stared at this word with astonishment. The old man in the black cloak was obviously puzzled as well and admitted that he had never heard of such a skill. The others present began poring over papers in the hope of finding information about the new skill. Rolf realized that his skill was previously unknown and noticed the people behind him begin to whisper. At this moment, An old man approached Rolf and announced that the recovery skill had never been recorded in this divine palace before, and it was a true discovery. Everyone around them began to excitedly discuss the news of the found, previously unknown skill. The whispers and whispers grew louder and louder, emphasizing the significance of what was happening. Overwhelmed with delight and pride, Rolf ran home. Bursting into the house, he immediately began calling for his grandmother. With joy on his face, he informed her of his new skill. Grandma, who was sitting in the corner, quietly remarked that she already knew about it. Rolf was amazed and asked how she could know about it so quickly. At that moment, a man whom Rolf had not noticed before stepped out of the shadows and explained that news of it was already walking the streets. The grandmother explained to Rolf that this man had been waiting for his return all along. The stranger introduced himself as the head of the Adventurers Guild, the Golden Lions, named Figaro. Hearing the name of such an influential person, Rolf was stunned. Figaro, without wasting any time, suggested to get straight to the point. He extended his hand to Rolf and offered to join their guild. Expressing confidence that the recovery skill would unlock its potential if Rolf became a member of the Golden Lions, he assured him of his support. Rolf, despite his excitement, still didn't know what the nature of his new skill was. He was unable to activate it and was therefore confused. Figaro asked him not to worry, explaining that Rolf had just become an adult and his skills, like everything else, would manifest themselves in time. The guild leader assured Rolf that he would take care of him and added that his grandmother would be happy if Rolf joined them. Rolf looked at his grandmother, and the latter, smiling, suggested that he do as he saw fit, adding that his parents would want him too. Rolf felt that there were many trials and adventures ahead of him, but he was ready for them. He thought for a moment, then nodded decisively and bowed to Figaro, asking him to take care of him. Figaro smiled warmly and shook Rolf's hand firmly, confirming his promise. He added that he believed in Rolf's potential and that together they could achieve great things. A few months later, Rolf was helping guild members by hauling heavy boxes. One of the men, a member of the guild, remarked with irritation that Rolf was useless. Hearing this, Rolf grabbed the boxes and, apologizing, assured him that he would do the job. The man, seeing his efforts, wondered how long Mr. Figaro was going to keep Rolf by their side. At that moment, a girl named Aria addressed him as Godot and informed him that the boss was summoning Rolf to his office. Rolf entered Figaro's office and the latter suddenly announced that he was expelling him from the Golden Lions. Rolf was shocked by this news. Figaro explained that he had been waiting for months for results from his recovery skill, but it had never activated. In fact, Rolf tried many methods, but his skill never manifested. In the end, he went about his daily chores, hoping to be of some use to the guild. Figaro explained that as Rolf knows, they have Gato with a sword peak and Aria with a vessel of magic in the guild. Useless people like Rolf had no place in their guild. He added that he could no longer cover for Rolf since other guild members were pressuring him. Rolf asked Figaro to wait, claiming that perhaps his skill would activate in a certain situation. Figaro held out a document to Rolf and explained that due to the fact that he was unable to activate his skill, the document stated the amount of compensation he must pay to the guild for not fulfilling his part of the conditions. Rolf glanced at the paper and began to read. Suddenly, he realized that the compensation was 5 million guards. He shouted that he could not earn such a sum, but Figaro offered to sell him the house and promised to turn a blind eye to the remaining amount. Rolf was dumbfounded by what he heard. He stated that his grandmother lived in the house and he was willing to do anything but sell the house. Rolf explained that his parents might come back, and if the house was gone, he might never see them again. Rolf begged Figaro to give him time, assuring him that he would earn money and pay off his debt. Figaro, smiling, agreed to leave him the house. Figaro suggested that Rolf try to join another adventurers guild to earn money. He doubted that anyone would accept him, however, and hinted that Rolf's direct route was to become a rubbish collector. Figaro strongly advised Rolf to try to pay off his debt by any means possible. A year after being expelled from the Golden Lions Guild, Rolf wandered the streets making a living as a rubbish collector. It was a dirty, thankless job, but he had no other. One day, while wandering the streets of the city, he noticed a small pebble on the ground. Picking it up, he found that it was a magic crystal, shimmering faintly in his hand. This find was his only catch of the day. His earnings were so paltry that he could barely make ends meet, let alone pay the interest on his debt. Rolf looked at the crystal in his hand and involuntarily compared himself to that stone. Like him, the crystal, once possessed of great power, now lay forgotten and unwanted. He had been kicked out of the Golden Lions a year ago, and since then, his recovery skill had never shown itself. The people in the city began to call him rubbish. None of the adventurer guilds accepted him. He was forced to perform the lowest paid and most humiliating tasks, such as picking up rubbish from the streets. Rolf tried his best to stay afloat, but fate was merciless to him. Their house was sold and they were kicked out onto the streets. 6 months later, his only family, his grandmother, died of illness. He felt devastated and depressed. Not only did he fail to become an adventurer, but he also failed to keep the promise he had made to his grandmother. Rolf was now standing over a huge hole in the ground meant for rubbish collection. He pondered his worthlessness, why he had inherited such a useless skill, and his thoughts took over him completely. It seemed to him that life had become an endless series of disappointments and failures. His gaze was fixed on the pebble lying in his palm when suddenly he heard a scream that broke the silence. Tearing himself away from his gloomy thoughts, Rolf quickly turned around and realized that the sound came from the thicket of the forest. In the forest, in a small clearing, the girl was desperately ordering the goblins not to come near her, but they paid no attention to her words, furiously advancing. She stood, preparing for battle, her face expressing determination and confidence despite the numerical superiority of the enemy. Suddenly Rolf, driven by some inner impulse, jumped out of the bushes and stood in front of her, shielding her from the approaching creatures. His heart was pounding, but he tried to remain calm. Now they stood side by side, facing the goblins. Rolf glanced at the girl with a corner of his eye and asked if she was all right. She nodded, her eyes glowing with gratitude and determination. Rolf himself was feverishly pondering his next steps. He had never encountered goblins before, and fear stiffened his movements. Looking around, he counted 3 goblins, each of whom looked threatening. Deciding that everything would be all right, he tried to remember how his father wielded a sword. His father was a master swordsman, and every morning Rolf trained as the man had willed. Rolf, following his father's precepts, honed his skills, hoping to someday achieve the same mastery. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the hilt of his sword and stood in a fighting stance, trying not to betray his excitement. One of the goblins, snarling and baring its fangs, moved forward, straight at Rolf, and he barely had time to bring his sword to bear. Suddenly he saw his blade crack, and a sharp shard of broken-off steel flew straight towards the girl. It all happened in the blink of an eye. The girl raised her hand without flinching for a second, looking confidently at the approaching shard. In the next instant, the shard seemed to explode into small pieces and crumbled to the ground. Rolf looked at it, not understanding what had happened and how the girl had done such a thing. He was about to ask her a question when suddenly he heard her scream, warning of danger. Turning around, he saw one of the goblins with a sword rushing at him from behind. Rolf managed to dodge at the last moment, and, using the inertia of movement, struck the goblin in the back. The creature fell to the ground, defeated. The 2 remaining goblins, seeing that their comrade in arms was dead, froze for a moment in indecision. Then, succumbing to panic, they rushed to flee into the thicket of the forest, leaving Rolf and the girl alone in the empty clearing. Rolf looked at the girl after catching his breath and noticed that she had hurt herself. A scratch on her arm was bleeding. He wanted to go over to her and ask if she was okay, but the girl recoiled and asked him not to touch her. Rolf immediately apologized, explaining that he had just seen her wound and wanted to help. The girl shook her head and explained that she possessed the destruction skill and any touch on her arm could be fatal. Rolf, looking at her in amazement, tried to realize what he had heard. He had never heard of such a skill before. He gradually realized why his sword shattered into pieces when she raised her hand. The girl, looking at the ground, nodded sadly. She told him that her hand destroys everything it touches, regardless of her will. Any object simply turned to ashes. Rolf was stunned to observe such an astounding and destructive power. The girl looked up at him and thanked him for saving her. She introduced herself as Elsa, and Rolf, smiling, introduced himself in return. Elsa apologized for her abruptness and explained that she still did not know how to fully control her skill. She added that she did not mean to hurt the person who saved her, and that the only thing that helps suppress her ability is the gloves she holds in her hands. Rolf tried to reassure her, saying that thanks to her skill, the sword shard didn't hurt her. Elsa smiled back at him, feeling warm and grateful for understanding for the first time in a long time. Rolf slowly approached the girl, not believing that it was finally over. Thoughts were swirling around in his head, and he asked her a question he had wanted to ask for a long time. He asked her what she was doing in a place like this, and how come she was attacked by goblins. Elsa started to speak, but suddenly Rolf noticed a collar around her neck that he hadn't seen before. His eyes widened in surprise, but he had no time to say anything before an ominous hissing sounded from the forest. The goblin, hunched over and furious, ran out of the thicket. Rolf immediately warned Elsa that one goblin had returned. He instinctively raised his sword, but remembered that it was broken. The goblin rushed straight at Elsa, holding his blade in front of him. Rolf did not hesitate and rushed towards the girl to protect her. He grabbed her and tried to leap aside. Elsa cried out frightened, realizing that he had touched her arm. She warned him that he would be destroyed. Rolf realized that perhaps he would indeed disappear. He had lived a short life and would probably die like this, having achieved nothing. But a warm thought arose in his heart: if he ended up benefiting someone, it wouldn't be so bad. He ordered Elsa to run, ready to meet his fate. Suddenly, a strange voice sounded in his head, and an inscription popped up in front of his eyes, stating that the condition for activating the skill had been fulfilled. His eyes widened in surprise. He didn't realize what it meant. The system asked him if he wished to activate the recovery skill. Rolf's inner voice confidently replied that yes. The next moment, the system noted that the iron sword was broken. Rolf read it with bewilderment. The system then asked a new question: did he want to recreate the legendary iron sword? Without hesitation, he said yes, and the sword began to appear in his hands. When the goblin was very close, Rolf thrust his newfound sword forward. The blade easily sliced the goblin in half, and it fell lifelessly to the ground. Rolf stood over the body, still trying to comprehend what had happened. Elsa looked at Rolf, her eyes wide with surprise and incomprehension. She couldn't believe that he had touched her hand and not been destroyed by her destructive power. Rolf, still holding her hand, tried to comprehend what was happening. He looked with wonder and awe at his sword, which had miraculously recovered. On this day, his skill that he had thought was useless had shown itself for the first time, and it had shown itself at a time when it was vital, and he had also met a girl with the destruction skill. That was the moment when he first felt the true power and meaning of his gift. Elsa, without taking her eyes off Rolf, suddenly asked if he was destined for her. Her words came out of the blue, and Rolf looked at her in surprise. He tried to realize what she meant, and why her question had resonated with him. He saw in her eyes a mixture of fear, hope, and despair that he understood better than anyone else. Rolf was still looking at his sword, stunned by its restoration and change. The weapon now glowed, it seemed to have taken on a new quality. Elsa, keeping her eyes on Rolf, realized that he had remained unharmed by touching her hand. She began to think that he was her chosen one, the one who could free her from the curse. Elsa, with a sad smile and a heavy heart, told Rolf about her life in the village. She was a cursed child, something she had been reminded of since she was a child. Her destruction skill, which destroyed everything she touched, made her an outcast. Rolf listened without averting his gaze, trying to understand the gravity of her fate. She told him that her mother had died just after she was born, the first victim of her destructive touch. Her father, despite his love for his daughter, once lost his hand to her skill. He died of illness, leaving Elsa alone in a world that feared her and her power. The villagers feared her as a natural disaster, and even she could not blame them for it. One day, out of nowhere, an extraordinary priest came to the village. He gave her father gloves that could suppress her powers. The priest also predicted that one day a man would appear who would free her from this curse and become her protector. This person would be able to touch her without fear of being destroyed. Rolf, surprised by her story, could hardly believe what he heard. He had not expected her story to be so tragic. Asking if he could be the man the priest spoke of, he received no answer. Rolf, still surprised and stunned by what was happening, asked Elsa why she was in the forest all alone. Elsa, slightly lowering her eyes, explained that she had been transported as a slave. Hearing this, Rolf looked at her in bewilderment, not understanding how this could have happened. Elsa nodded affirmatively and continued the story. The previous year had been a bad harvest, and the villagers, not knowing how to survive, offered to sell her, a cursed child, into slavery to the house of Volzensi of Adgra in exchange for food. Rolf, still comprehending her story, recalled again the moment when the system suddenly appeared before him. He remembered how the system had offered to recreate his broken iron sword, and how it had been transformed into a legendary weapon. At that moment, he realized that his seemingly useless recovery skill had shown itself for the first time. These thoughts swirled around in his head, and he was beginning to realize how all the events had led him to this meeting with Elsa. Elsa, looking at him with a warm smile, remarked that this was how they had met. Confidence and hope shone in her eyes as she uttered that she believed he was her chosen one. That word echoed in Rolf's mind. He looked at her, feeling a strange combination of surprise and agreement. He felt that perhaps fate had indeed brought them together. Rolf, sighing, told Elsa that for the first time in his life, his skill had activated. They were sitting on large rocks in the middle of the forest, the trees were rustling around them, and what had just happened was still stirring their thoughts. Elsa realized the importance of this moment, and felt that fate had finally given them a chance. Rolf shared that his skill had never shown itself before, and that his life was marred by a huge debt that he could not pay off. It was because of this that he ended up in the forest, where he heard her cries for help. Elsa, with a slight surprise in her voice, surmised that he too was alone in that forest, which led them to this meeting. Suddenly, her gaze cleared, and she suggested that Rolf once again try to use his recovery skill. Pointing to a short sword lying on the ground, she suggested that he try it on it. Rolf, hesitating but still agreeing, reached his hand towards the sword and concentrated, trying to activate his skill. However, nothing was happening, and he couldn't understand why his power wasn't working. Elsa, trying to cheer him up, suggested that he try again, reminding him how it had worked last time. Suddenly, Rolf, looking back at her, asked Elsa to destroy the short sword with his destructive skill. Elsa, though surprised by such a request, agreed. The next moment, touching the sword, she shattered it into small pieces. The shards of the sword fell to the ground, leaving them stunned. They both looked at the remains of the sword with surprise and confusion. Elsa, seeing Rolf's confusion, tried to support him. She said that there was no need to be upset as they had just started their journey. Rolf turned sharply to Elsa and grabbed her hand without thinking. At that moment, a system message appeared in front of his eyes, indicating that a broken short sword had been detected and offering to repair it. Thinking back to the previous occasion when they were holding hands and Elsa was destroying something, Rolf suddenly realized that their joint actions could be the key to activating his skill. He decided to test his hunch. Perhaps the items destroyed by her skill were restored when they touched each other. Elsa looked at him in disbelief, not believing in such a possibility. She had never heard of such a skill. The system in front of Rolf displayed the various sword qualities he could recreate, from ordinary to legendary. Next to them were percentages, probably representing the probability of success. Rolf chose the ordinary quality with a 90% probability, deciding to start with the easier task. Literally seconds later, they had a new short sword in their hands. Rolf was ecstatic as he realized that his hunch had turned out to be correct. He could even see the characteristics of the sword, which confirmed its successful recovery. Rolf realized why his skill hadn't worked before. If his theory was correct, his skill wouldn't function without Elsa. Elsa, who realized the essence of her destruction skill, thought that with Rolf, her power could become something else. She squeezed his hand tightly, and exclaimed joyfully that their skills were surprisingly complementary. Their combined strength gave her confidence that they could become one. However, their musings were interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming from behind the trees. A huge orc accompanied by a group of goblins was moving towards them. When Elsa saw them, she screamed with fear, and the orc looked at Rolf and said with rage that he had killed his friends and now he would kill him. Elsa quickly informed Rolf that this was the same orc who had attacked their wagon. Rolf, trying to protect her, shouted for her to pull back, but Elsa insisted that she too would fight. The orc, annoyed by their conversation, ordered them to stop bickering. Rolf, without wasting a moment, rushed to attack the goblins, wielding a sword that seemed incredibly sharp and light. With each swing of the blade, he felt it easily pass through flesh and bone as if cutting through the air. One by one the goblins fell at his feet before they even realized what was happening. Blood splattered in all directions, but Rolf kept moving forward, absorbed in the battle. He looked at the blade and couldn't believe his eyes. The sword glowed with an inner light, as if it were filled with an unknown magical energy. The sharpness and lightness of the sword stunned him, for he had never felt anything like it. The blade seemed to guide his hand, directing his blows with the utmost precision. Rolf realized that the system had recreated not just the sword, but something much more powerful and advanced. At that moment he heard heavy footsteps and a muffled growl. A huge orc was coming at him, swinging a massive club that seemed capable of breaking any obstacle in its path. The orc was furious, his eyes burning with hatred and his muscles rolling over under his skin like steel cables. Rolf felt a chill run down his spine, but fear was quickly replaced by determination. He realized that there was no retreat. The orc swung his club, preparing to deliver a devastating blow. At that moment, Rolf, gathering all his strength, jumped up, evading the blow, and with lightning speed struck a counter-strike. The blade passed through the orc's body like butter, slicing it in half. The orc's body split into 2 pieces, which fell to the ground with a thud, raising a cloud of dust and blood. Rolf stood, breathing heavily, and stared at the disintegrated body. He could hardly believe he had been able to kill an orc, even though he had never been in a real fight before. His heart was racing, adrenaline boiling in his blood, but with it came the realization he had done it. His first real fight was over, and he had come out of it victorious. Elsa ran up to Rolf, barely holding back tears of joy that he was in one piece. She told him that she had become fearful for his life, and how glad she was that he had won that terrible battle. Rolf, leaning tiredly on his sword, pointed at the defeated orc, assuming that he was the one who had ordered the goblins to ambush her wagon. Rolf turned to Elsa, looking at the fallen orc and the goblin bodies scattered around him, a concerned look on his face. He asked her what she was going to do now and if she wanted to join him on his wanderings. Elsa, sighing, raised her hand and pointed to the collar shackling her neck. She explained that the collar had powerful detection magic attached to it, and if she tried to remove it, it would explode, killing her on the spot. Elsa added that she would remain a slave of Volsenshi as long as the magical artifact existed, and she had just met her chosen one in whom she hoped to find salvation. Hearing her words, Rolf suddenly shook his head negatively, rage and determination glowing in his eyes. He glanced at his sword, now shining in its legendary quality, and turned to Elsa. Rolf told her that the sword was worth 3 million guards and offered to use it to free her. Elsa smiled, grateful for his concern, but added that he had better keep the sword. She explained that it was a gift from his father, and also the first item they had created together. Rolf understood her feelings, but suddenly a new thought occurred to him. Rolf suggested that he use the weapons left by the monsters, restore them, and make money. Elsa, silent and thoughtful, did not answer for a long time, and Rolf, realizing the gravity of their situation, begged her to help him. His words sounded sincere and desperate, for he realized that without her his skill was useless. Finally, Elsa agreed, offering to start work immediately. They began picking up the broken weapons scattered around, each time touching hands and concentrating on rebuilding. Several hours passed and they sat on the ground, exhausted, inspecting the fruits of their labor. The restored blades, maces, and shields lay before them, gleaming clean and new. Rolf, however, sighed heavily and noticed that not a single legendary item was among the many restored items. He felt disappointed and tired, doubting the success of their venture. Suddenly, Elsa saw a small crystal on the ground left by the goblins. She offered to destroy it with her skill. However, Rolf skeptically pointed out that you can't earn much from such crystals, because the monster's magic hardens and turns into a crystal after its death, losing most of its value. However, that didn't stop Elsa. She resolutely put her hand on the crystal, and it shattered into pieces, glittering with shards. At that moment, the system issued a notification that a destroyed crystal had been detected, with a suggestion to restore it. Rolf suddenly felt a surge of magical energy coursing through his body. He realized that he had gained experience points for his skill and told Elsa about it. The latter, astonished, said that she had never heard of a skill level increase. Rolf, scrutinizing the information in the system, discovered that his regeneration skill had reached level 2 and the chance of success had increased by 1%. He surmised that he could raise the level of his skill by destroying monsters, which opened up new possibilities for him. Each new achievement increased the chance of successful regeneration, making their teamwork more and more effective. Rolf looked around the ground and the recovered weapons, trying to estimate their value. In total, their labor was valued at about 10,000 guards, which he knew was not enough for their purposes. Elsa, seeing his disappointment, tried to reassure him, telling him that it was all right and that they could find another way. But Rolf, seething with indignation and determination, exclaimed that she had become a slave, even though she had done nothing wrong. It was blatantly unjust, and he was not going to give up until he freed her. Elsa, touched by his determination and concern, lowered her eyes and quietly thanked him for his support and willingness to fight for her freedom. Suddenly a new thought occurred to Rolf. He remembered that there were medicinal herbs in the area that could speed up the healing of wounds. Rising, he plucked one of the herbs and offered it to Elsa to apply to her wound. Elsa, despite her wounds, declared that it was just a trifle and not worth the trouble. Rolf, realizing that the wound could lead to serious infection, insisted on applying the healing herb himself. Moving closer, he gently placed the herb on her wound. Elsa, feeling warm and caring, thanked him. At that moment, a thought flashed in her eyes, and she asked if Rolf could regenerate herbs as well as weapons. Rolf was surprised, not having thought about it before, but he saw a rational grain in her words. Elsa explained that if they could regenerate herbs, they could heal even the most severe wounds, and legendary herbs could be worth a lot of money. Rolf realized that this could indeed be a lifesaver and offered to try it immediately. They set to work, concentrating on recovering every herb they could get their hands on. Time flowed imperceptibly, and soon a whole pile of fresh, shiny leaves lay before them, which they recreated. Rolf took one of the leaves, noticing its amazing properties. These herbs were of legendary quality with a recovery rate of 300. They could instantly heal severe wounds and burns. With admiration, Rolf estimated that one such herb was worth about 500,000 guards. Elsa was stunned by their cost, not believing her ears. Rolf looked at Elsa in amazement, realizing that the herbs they were able to recover were worth an incredible amount of money. He placed the leaves to the weapon and enthusiastically declared that their combined labor was valued at as much as 6.5 million guards. Rolf's eyes sparkled with joy as he realized that they were able to earn such an impressive sum through their own efforts. Elsa, in turn, was amazed at their success. The cost of herbs and recovered weapons opened up new vistas of possibilities for her. Rolf, amazed by their success, wondered if the sum would be enough to free Elsa. She looked at Rolf, expressing doubt as to whether he should use it all on her freedom, after all the items had been created by him. Rolf, with firm conviction, replied that it was their common achievement, their joint labor. Elsa, deeply moved by his words, lifted herself up and, gathering her thoughts, asked him for one favor. Elsa suddenly touched her clothes, completely tattered and out of shape. Like a cloud, the clothes began to slowly dissolve, turning into rags on her body. Elsa explained to Rolf that her clothes had already turned into useless rags. A mixture of amazement and worry peeped from her face, and she asked him to restore her image. Rolf only nodded in response, understanding her need without words. A moment later, the system had already offered to restore her clothes, and Rolf made that decision without thinking. But before he could do anything, Elsa approached him from behind. Her arms embraced him with such a genuine sense of gratitude that Rolf felt excitement and pride fill his heart. She was not shy about expressing her joy. There was a wonderful mixture of gratitude and surprise in her voice. Elsa confessed that she never thought that someone could need her so much and feel the joy of her help. She then shared with Rolf her dream of touching someone. Elsa asked Rolf to allow her to experience this moment, to give her the chance to savor this unique opportunity. Rolf silently agreed, feeling the warmth and gratitude from Elsa fill his heart. They stood like that, her arms encircling him with a tenderness and appreciation that penetrated all the way to his soul. In that moment, it was as if time had stopped, and they savored this moment of tranquility in the brightly colored clearing. The rays of the sun played in their hair, creating an atmosphere of warmth and coziness. In the distance, a sudden, moving silhouette appeared. The unknown man approached with quick steps, his figure becoming clearer and clearer against the clear sky and green grass. But Rolf and Elsa remained motionless, blending in with the surrounding nature as if they were part of this perfect moment in harmony with the world around them. Elsa stood hugging Rolf, and he was beginning to feel a little embarrassed, feeling his cheeks blush. This moment seemed so precious to both of them that they did not want to interrupt it. However, their idyll was broken by the sudden appearance of an elderly man who ran up to them waving his arms and screaming desperately for help. His face was twisted with terror, and he gasped as he tried to get his message across. The man shouted that the wagon was being attacked by goblins and an orc, and his voice shook with fear. As he came closer, he began to bow, clearly in panic. Elsa looked at the man and suddenly recognized him as the tax inspector of the Boukensha family, Almani-san. There was relief in his eyes as he recognized Elsa and noticed that she was unharmed. He could not believe his eyes when he saw her free. Almani started to mutter something about how this was possible, but Elsa interrupted him, pointing to Rolf and explaining that he was the one who had defeated the orc, so Almani could rest easy. The inspector looked at Rolf skeptically, his eyes expressing doubt and disbelief. Then Elsa took out the orc's horn and handed it to Almani, adding that Rolf had not only defeated the monster but also saved her. Almani, scrutinizing the horn, could not believe what he had heard. He twirled the horn in his hands, perplexed as to how such a young man could handle an orc. However, when he looked at Rolf's determined face, he realized that he could indeed defeat an orc. After gathering his thoughts, he made a request to Rolf. Rolf pondered over Almani's suggestion, who persistently asked him for help. The tax collector explained that he needed Rolf to help him recover the money from the wagon. He said that their wagon had been accompanied by the escorts of the young master of the Golden Lions, but at the first appearance of the monsters, they had abandoned everything and fled. The wagon full of money intended for delivery to Adgara was unprotected. Almani begged Rolf to help him get the money back, emphasizing that it was a matter of life and death. He added that Rolf would certainly be handsomely rewarded for his courage and help. Rolf listened carefully to the inspector, pondering what he had heard. After brief deliberation, he agreed to accept the assignment, but made one condition. Almani, without hiding his excitement, prepared to listen to this condition. Rolf firmly stated that he wanted his freedom for Elsa in return for his help. Almani was stunned by such a demand and asked if Rolf wanted to ransom her. Rolf replied that he had no intention of buying her freedom, but simply wanted her to be free of any obligation and to be able to live her life. The inspector frowned, thinking deeply about Rolf's proposal. He recalled that the debt of Elsa's village was the enormous sum of 3 million gardas and asked if Rolf could pay that sum. Rolf admitted that he did not have that kind of money but offered another deal. He showed Almani 6 leaves of a rare herb, explaining that each was worth 500,000 guards. The inspector took one of the leaflets with disbelief, laughing at the audacity of such a statement. However, after scrutinizing the grass, his face changed. He realized that the price of 500,000 guards for each leaf was even too low for such a rarity. Almani, realizing the value of the offer, agreed to Rolf's terms. He promised that Elsa would be free as soon as they recovered the money from the wagon. Rolf and Elsa glanced over, their eyes glowing with joy and relief. Together with Almani, they headed towards the place where the wagon had been left. The road was not easy, but Rolf and Elsa's determination was unwavering. Rolf approached the wagon overflowing with crates and chests full of various valuables and money. Each movement was careful and attentive as he realized the importance of each item. Together with Almani, they methodically pulled out the contents of the wagon, checking each crate and chest to make sure nothing was lost or damaged. Working side by side, they created an atmosphere of tense but productive work. After they completed their task, Almani made his way towards Elsa. He stopped in front of her and, looking into her eyes, gently removed her collar. Elsa was stunned and did not immediately realize what had happened. When it dawned on her that she was finally free, she exclaimed with joy, as if letting out all the emotions that had accumulated. Tears of gratitude glistened in her eyes. She immediately ran over to Rolf and hugged him, pulling him against her with such force that he almost choked. Almani, watching this touching scene, could not hold back a smile. He recalled his youth when emotions were as strong and sincere. His heart was filled with warmth, and he felt that he had helped not only to return the money but also to change someone's life for the better. He approached Rolf and apologized for his earlier doubts about his abilities, offering to walk them to town. When the wagon reached the walls of the city, Rolf and Elsa looked round the high stone walls, which inspired a sense of security and stability. They epitomized the boundary between a wild world full of danger. Rolf thanked Almani for everything he had done, feeling sincere gratitude for his help and for freeing Elsa. Almani thanked Rolf for his help, noting that the transaction had been extremely profitable. He pointed out that the sale of the rare herbs would bring a considerable profit. When they reached the town, Almani again addressed Rolf, reminding him of his promise to issue a reward for the completed task. As if a sudden thought had dawned on him, and he apologized, explaining that he had to leave the wagon at the inn first. Afterwards, Almani suggested that Rolf meet at the Adventurers Guild. After a while, Rolf and Elsa entered the spacious guild building. Inside, there was a lively and noisy atmosphere. Many tables were occupied by various adventurers who drank, ate, laughed loudly, and discussed the latest news and exploits. For Elsa, this place was new and amazing. She finally got to see what the guild looked like from the inside. Elsa, though a little embarrassed, immediately noticed the huge number of people around. Their attention quickly shifted to Ralph, and those who recognized him began to whisper derisively. Some of them loudly proclaimed that the rubbish collector had brought a girl, and a rather pretty one at that. Their sarcastic comments resounded everywhere like echoes. The girl behind the counter, noticing Ralph, smiled welcomingly, and, assuming he had brought trophies, asked to see them. Ralph nodded and, not embarrassed by the taunts, laid the bag on the table. He stated that he wanted to sell everything in it, and began pulling out magic crystals as well as an orc horn. When the girl took the orc horn in her hands, her eyes went wide with surprise. Everyone around froze and then began to whisper, their disbelief growing. Soon the hall was filled with loud laughter and sarcastic comments. They couldn't believe that Ralph had really brought an orc horn. Someone even joked that it was an orc horn, which caused another wave of laughter. Elsa, hearing the ridicule, couldn't contain herself. Her voice cut through the noise, announcing that Ralph had defeated the goblins and the orc. Her words were spoken with such confidence and anger that everyone was silent for a moment, but then started laughing again, declaring that it was ridiculous and no one believed her. They couldn't imagine that Ralph, an ordinary rubbish collector, could overpower such dangerous creatures. Ralph looked at Elsa with gratitude and tenderness. He understood her desire to protect him, but he also knew that their words would not change the minds of those around them. He thanked her for her support, but quietly asked her not to get into such arguments again. Elsa was confused. She couldn't understand why people didn't believe in Ralph. After all, she had seen him in action, his incredible skill and strength. At that moment, the girl behind the counter suddenly announced that everything Ralph had brought was genuine. Her face lit up with a smile when she said that it was an astounding piece of work. She added that she had appraised the crystals and the orc horn, and it totaled 250,000 guard. Everyone around who had been laughing before, realizing that they were wrong, began to discreetly back away. Suddenly Figaro appeared beside them. His appearance caused even more tension in the air. He approached Ralph and, noting with a chuckle that Ralph had come in person, made a sarcastic remark that God had sent him some trifles. Figaro reminded him of the debt he owed. However, by his tone, he only increased Ralph's irritation. The convoys standing next to Figaro looked at Ralph with distrust and suspicion, and one of them asked if he wanted to cheat them by selling their own materials. Ralph was confused and did not understand what they were talking about. The convoys, grinning, declared that it was they who had overpowered the goblins who had attacked the wagon, and that the tax inspector had escaped, and that they had returned to the town to report this immediately to Figaro. They then pointed to Ralph and accused him of stealing all the materials they had left in the wagon. Ralph and Elsa were stunned by these accusations. Elsa, with indignation in her voice, shouted that it was all a brazen lie, and that the convoyers had escaped on their own when the orc appeared. The convoyers, angry, asked her what she was talking about, clearly not expecting this turn of events. Figaro looked at Elsa and advised her not to tell any more lies, adding that the members of the Golden Lions would never have escaped when they saw an ordinary orc. Ralph declared with firmness in his voice that Elsa was telling the truth, causing an indignant murmur among the escorts. One of them, unable to contain his fury, stepped forward and asked Ralph if he wanted to test their patience once more and question their honor. Suddenly a confident voice rang out in the hall. It was Almani's. Apologizing for the delay, he stepped closer and, noticing those assembled, squinted his eyes in slight surprise. Figaro, with undisguised irritation, turned to Almani and asked what he was doing here. Almani calmly explained that Ralph had indeed helped him retrieve the money from the wagon when the escorts had fled at the sight of the orc. He emphasized that Ralph had not only defeated the monster, but had shown incredible courage. Almani, addressing Figaro, stated that he intended to reward Ralph for his feat. The convoys, upon hearing Almani's words, became embarrassed, realizing that their lies had been exposed. They began to turn away, not knowing how to react. Figaro, realizing the gravity of the situation, slowly lowered his head, and the convoyers clumsily tried to apologize, muttering excuses. Almani, looking at Figaro, reminded him that he had told him more than once to leave the foolish guild and take his father's place. Figaro, flaring with anger, ordered him to be silent, announced that he was leaving, and dismissed his escorts. Stunned, they stood there, unable to believe their ears, while Almani, with sadness in his eyes, realized that it was no longer possible to change Figaro. Elsa, seeing the situation resolved, smiled with a sense of deep satisfaction. A few minutes later, they walked outside, leaving behind the bustle and tense gazes of the guild members. There was a warm evening fragrance in the air, and a light breeze gently ruffled Elsa's hair. Almani, with a slight weariness in his voice, stopped and, turning to Ralph, apologized for all the trouble the young Master Figaro's underlings had caused him. He held out a pouch of money, declaring that it was his well-deserved reward. Almani leaned closer so that no one could hear his words, and whispered that he also had a small gift from him personally. Ralph accepted the pouch, feeling its weight and the clinking of coins inside. He nodded in gratitude, unable to find the words to express the storm of emotions that raged within. After a while, they were walking down a wide corridor lit by the soft light of torches. The stone walls of the hall echoed their footsteps, creating a sense of coziness and calm. They came to a large room, spacious and bright, with luxurious furniture and a huge bed in the center. It was a real refuge that Almani had provided them, where they could forget all the difficulties and worries. Elsa, with delight in her eyes, immediately threw herself on the bed, feeling its softness and spaciousness embrace her tired body. She closed her eyes, savoring this moment, and then turned to Ralph, inviting him to join her. Her gaze read sincere gratitude and tenderness. Ralph, embarrassed and touched by her words, slowly walked over to the bed and sat down beside it. The soft pillows and blankets embraced him, creating a feeling of warmth and peace. Ralph opened his eyes slowly as the morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, flooding the room with soft light. Elsa lay before him, her face calm, her hair spread across the pillow. He got out of bed and, stretching, began to recall the events of the previous night. Ralph remembered how last night Elsa had suggested that he lie down next to her on the bed. He hesitated at first, not sure if he was ready for such intimacy, but nevertheless yielded to her soft voice and lay down. For half the night he lay with his eyes open, listening to her measured breathing. He did not understand how one could sleep under such conditions. His thoughts were racing and his heart was beating fast. Her presence seemed to fill the entire room. She slept peacefully, as if all the anxieties of the world had bypassed her. In the night, rising on his elbow, Ralph looked at Elsa. She looked peaceful, and the sight reminded him of how busy and intense their day had been. He thought about how they had overcome all the difficulties together, and how she had trusted him. This thought lulled him to sleep, and he fell asleep unnoticed. The morning came quietly and peacefully. Ralph got out of bed, went to the window and looked out at the waking city. It had been a long time since he had had such a peaceful morning, free from worries and cares. At this time, Elsa woke up when she heard his footsteps and wished him good morning. Her voice was soft and warm, and there was something special about it. Later, they strolled leisurely through the city, enjoying its hustle and bustle. Elsa looked at Ralph and asked him what he was going to do today. He replied that the first thing he needed to do was to take some errand to the guild. Her reaction was unexpected. She enthusiastically declared that she too wanted to become an adventurer like him. Ralph was amazed at her determination. She explained that she now understood how to use her skill and that by becoming an adventurer, she would be able to always be there for him. These words touched him. He smiled and suggested that she register with the guild. When they entered the guild building, they were greeted by the girl behind the counter. She helped Elsa register and after a while handed her a card. It was simple but meaningful, a symbol of new beginnings and new opportunities. The girl explained that Elsa was now officially registered in the guild. She then began to explain the ranking system, starting with Iron, the lowest level. The girl explained that adventurers take on various errands around the country and receive rewards for successful completion. As they accumulate achievements and experience, their rank will increase, opening access to more challenging and higher-paying assignments. She added that the Platinum rank is the highest level that only the most outstanding adventurers can reach. Elsa, holding her card in her hand, looked at Ralph. She could see admiration and determination in her eyes. She remembered that Ralph's parents had reached the Platinum rank and asked with genuine interest what rank he was. Ralph, slightly embarrassed, confessed that he still had an Iron rank. Elsa, without losing enthusiasm, declared that now that they were together, they would make every effort to reach the Platinum rank. Her confidence and enthusiasm were contagious. Ralph nodded, feeling a warm wave of support and admiration. He couldn't help but notice how sweet and sincere Elsa was in her desire for adventure. Elsa stood in front of the notice board, scrutinizing the tasks on offer. The guild hall was filled with noise and bustle. Adventurers of all ranks were discussing their plans, preparing for new exploits. The advertisements were full of all kinds of assignments, from escorting dignitaries to exploring mysterious dungeons. But Ralph, standing next to Elsa, remarked that such assignments were only available to adventurers of higher ranks. He moved closer and noticed the quests hanging below, at the eye level of the newcomers. There were more modest errands there, such as gathering medicinal herbs or hunting goblins. Elsa offered to try any of these, but Rolf reminded her that they needed to stop by the armorer first and buy her equipment. He also added that the weapons they made yesterday also needed to be sold. After a while, they found themselves in the armorer's workshop. There was a pleasant silence inside, broken only by the clinking of metal and the crackling of burning charcoal. The armorer, an experienced and stern man, was examining their weapons. He examined every detail, checking the quality of workmanship. Finally, he gave his verdict. All the weapons were brand new and valued at 10,000 guard. Rolf nodded in satisfaction, agreeing to the amount offered. The armorer stepped aside to prepare the payment, and Rolf remained waiting. At that moment, Elsa quietly approached him and, with a faint smile, asked what he thought of her new equipment. Rolf turned round and saw her in her new, very beautiful and rather revealing outfit. A little confused, he remarked that the outfit was too revealing, to which Elsa cheerfully stated that she was joking. She then ran off to the back of the shop to choose a more appropriate outfit. Rolf exhaled with relief. A short while later, Elsa was standing beside Rolf, clutching the dainty bow tightly in her hands. Her eyes shone with enthusiasm as she declared that she wanted to take it. After all, she had often hunted in her home village and had good shooting skills. Rolf examined the chosen bow carefully, nodded approvingly, and headed to the armor rack. There, a new shield and breastplate caught his eye. He took them in his hands, feeling the heaviness and durability of the equipment. Rolf, holding them in front of him, declared that he intended to purchase these items. He noticed that used equipment was being sold here at very affordable prices, which surprised him. At that moment, the armorer, a massive man with a thick beard and good-natured eyes, approached them. He handed them a pouch containing the money earned from the sale of their own weapons. The gunsmith thanked them for the transaction, assuring them that their new gear was of excellent quality. The conversation with the gunsmith turned smoothly to the news. He told them that Red-Eyed Bernard, the legendary adventurer trader, who had been the subject of incredible rumors, would soon be arriving in Adgara. The armorer added that if anything of value was found, the latter might be interested in acquiring it. Rolf, upon hearing this, could not hide his surprise and admiration. Elsa, unfamiliar with the name, asked who Red-Eyed Bernard was. The armorer eagerly explained that Bernard was a distinguished adventurer whose encounter could be truly momentous. He, according to the armorer, travels the world collecting, buying and selling the rarest and most valuable artifacts. Elsa was amazed at what she heard and could not hide her surprise. Suddenly, the armorer noticed that Rolf was still holding the old equipment. He suggested that they make sure it was in good condition, for otherwise the risk to life was too great. Rolf thanked him for his concern, but assured him that everything was fine, and he and Elsa left the workshop. Walking through the streets of the town, they headed towards the forest. There, among the tall trees in the shade of the thick crowns, Elsa decided to use her special skill. She concentrated, and determination flashed in her eyes. Rolf watched with interest as Elsa carefully destroyed the old breastplate. Then, Rolf used his skill to restore it. A satisfied smile appeared on Elsa's face as the leather breastplate was transformed, becoming stronger and more comfortable. Elsa stated that she knew it would be great, and proudly wore the upgraded equipment. Rolf looked at Elsa and couldn't help but smile. He noticed that the new breastplate really suited her, but still asked if it was too small. Elsa assured him with a sly smile that it was fine and the bib fit her. She then suggested that they waste no time and get on with their errands. Rolf, realizing the importance of their mission, suggested they start by gathering medicinal herbs. Their path lay through a dense forest. They slowly made their way forward, crawling on their knees and scrutinizing the ground for the right plants. Suddenly, Elsa interrupted the silence by asking Rolf an unexpected question about the possibility of recovering soil and other items. She remembered how, in the past, she had accidentally destroyed fields and other objects, and now she was curious if they could be brought back to life. Rolf pondered her words and suggested she try. Elsa touched the ground, and suddenly the soil beneath her hands began to crumble. Rolf easily repaired it, but noticed that the soil was ordinary and of no value. Suddenly, the system alerted him to unlock a new active skill called material synthesis. This discovery caused him genuine surprise, and he immediately shared the news with Elsa. Elsa, interested in the new possibilities, readily agreed to conduct another experiment. She selected the nearest grass and destroyed it. The system immediately informed Rolf that it had discovered medicinal and poisonous herbs that could be combined. By synthesizing these herbs, he obtained a medicinal pill. Encouraged by his success, Rolf suggested further experimentation. They combined various items and the results were astounding. By combining grass with grass, they obtained a strong rope. The wood and the strong rope became a mace, and after adding a goblin bone, it became a goblin mace. Rolf was delighted at how many things could be created with the new skill. However, their joy was interrupted by strange sounds coming from a hole in the ground recently destroyed by Elsa. A huge skeleton with a sword in its hands began to emerge from it. Rolf and Elsa screamed in surprise. Rolf, without wasting a second, swung his sword and chopped the skeleton in two. The bone shards scattered on the ground, but his thoughts immediately turned to the strange appearance of the skeleton in this place. While he was pondering, Elsa pointed him to a hole in the ground. The soil that Rolf had recovered had collapsed, revealing a passage into the dungeon. They gingerly stepped inside, amazed that such a dungeon could be so close to the city. The dark corridors of the dungeon seemed endless. Every step echoed in the silence, creating an ominous atmosphere. Rolf looked around carefully, realizing that this place could pose a serious threat to the city. He suggested looking around to make sure the dungeon wasn't hiding demons or other dangerous creatures. He reminded Elsa of the traps often found in such places and asked her to be extremely careful. Rolf and Elsa, standing in front of the open dungeon, decided to waste no time and make sure it was not a threat to the city. They realized that if it was indeed a lair of goblins, they would be able to both complete the task of eliminating them and keep the locals safe. Their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, where the walls seemed too smooth and flat for a natural dungeon. Rolf noticed this and shared his suspicions with Elsa. He felt that this place had been created or at least refined by someone with a specific purpose. Rolf froze for a moment, gazing into the flames of the torch he held in his hand. It seemed to him that a slight breeze was blowing from one direction. Elsa, noticing his concentration, asked what was bothering him. Rolf explained that he felt a breeze, which was strange for a closed dungeon. Suddenly Elsa ordered him to move over, and he immediately saw the taut fishing line directly behind her. Rolf shouted for her to be careful, but Elsa had already had time to react. In one motion, she destroyed the wall in front of her, and a hidden room opened up in front of them. Rolf and Elsa stood in the center of an empty room with only a strange crystal ball resting on a pedestal. Looking back at the hole in the wall that Elsa had created, Rolf realized that this may have been the original entrance to the dungeon. Elsa stared intently at the orb, wondering about its purpose and magical nature. Cautiously approaching the artifact, Rolf noticed that there was not the slightest trace of touch on it. His fingers lightly touched the crystal, and at that moment the silence was broken by loud mechanical sounds. Elsa turned warily in the direction of the sound, and Rolf realized that he had activated the trap. Skeletons armed with rusty swords and daggers began to appear from the dark corners of the room. Their eye sockets burned with an ominous red light, creating an ominous contrast to the semi-darkness of the room. Rolf quickly grabbed his sword and began desperately chopping down the skeletons, trying to protect himself and Elsa. Each blow of the sword blew one skeleton to ashes, but new ones appeared in its place. The battle was getting fiercer and fiercer. At one point, one of the skeletons, faster and stronger than the others, raised his sword over Elsa. Rolf, noticing this, reacted instantly, chopping the enemy in two. The bones crumbled to the ground, stripped of the magical power holding them together. The battle continued, and Rolf realized that they had fallen into an elaborate trap. Elsa, noticing his tension, apologized for his carelessness, but Rolf reassured her that it was all right. He knew he couldn't relax now, and suggested they continue exploring the dungeon, but with more caution. Walking through the narrow corridors, they stopped suddenly in front of a small hole in the wall. Rolf examined it carefully, not realizing what the hole was. Elsa guessed that it might be connected to the crystal ball they had picked up. They carefully put the ball into the hole and a new passage opened before them. Elsa and Rolf stood in a huge hall filled with ancient statues and remnants of former grandeur. The soft light of torches flickered on the walls, casting ominous shadows. In the center of the hall stood a statue of a girl with a wolf, surrounded by remnants of former grandeur. Elsa, mesmerized by what she saw, approached the stone wolf and touched it lightly. Suddenly everything lit up with a bright light, and Elsa was thrown back. Rolf, seeing this, screamed in terror, but the light disappeared instantly and the stone statue vanished into thin air. When their eyes became accustomed to the semi-darkness again, they saw that in the center of the room, on the marble floor, lay a small black wolf cub, shrouded in a light that was gradually fading away. The wolf cub was breathing heavily, and its black fur was stained with blood. Elsa looked at him with horror and despair in her eyes. Rolf, wasting no time, took out the healing pill they had recently made. Elsa tried to feed the pill to the wolf cub, but the bleeding would not stop. Suddenly Rolf shouted at her to use her destruction skill on the wolf. Elsa, alarmed and confused, said she couldn't do it for fear that the wolf cub would just disappear. She felt guilty about what had happened, but Rolf decisively interrupted her musings. He promised that he could save him. Rolf assured her that his ability to rebuild what had been destroyed had improved since they began traveling together. He said he had faith in his skill and asked Elsa to trust him. Elsa, with doubt in her eyes, looked at Rolf. His confidence and determination made her believe that everything would be fine. She nodded and declared that she believed him. They interlocked their hands, creating a powerful alliance between their skills. At the same moment, Elsa gently touched the wolf cub using her destruction skill. Rolf, in turn, activated his recovery skill. A system message instantly notified Rolf that his recovery skill had broken the seal holding the legendary demon wolf with a quality of 100%. Rolf faced a difficult choice, realizing that the only solution available to him was to use his recovery skill to save the little black wolf. Realizing that he only had one choice, he agreed to use the skill to fully restore the wolf cub. A bright light shone around them again, illuminating the entire room. The light was so intense that Rolf and Elsa had to close their eyes. When the light finally faded, they cautiously opened their eyes and saw a small black wolf cub in front of them. The wolf cub sat in front of them, wagging its tail happily, its eyes glowing with gratitude. Rolf and Elsa stood stunned, realizing that they had saved the wolf and discovered something more significant than just a dungeon. Elsa, wiping away tears of joy, hugged the little black wolf cub, feeling relieved that he had been saved. She cuddled him against her, feeling his little heart beating next to hers. The wolf cub, as if understanding her emotions, barked, filling the room with joyful sounds. Rolf, watching this scene, couldn't help but smile. His recovery skill had worked, and he felt proud of himself. However, doubts crept into his head. This wolf cub was a demonic creature, and he couldn't predict what that meant for their future. Elsa looked at Rolf with a twinkle in her eyes, winked at him, and offered to leave the wolf cub with them. Later, strolling through the city, they were no longer alone. The little wolf cub, wagging its tail merrily, accompanied them, looking around curiously. Elsa noticed that the wolf cub liked walking in the city, and said with a smile that it was all thanks to Rolf. Elsa, unable to contain her joy, took the little wolf cub in her arms and lovingly named him Reese, saying that he was very pretty. Rolf couldn't hold back a smile when he noticed how quickly she named him. Elsa, nodding, said that the name suited him perfectly, and Rolf agreed that it was indeed cute. Suddenly they were called out by Almani. He was out of breath, his face expressing worry. Rolf immediately asked him what was wrong. Almani said that yesterday he had purchased some medicinal herbs from Rolf, and today a man had bought them all back, showing extraordinary interest in their origin. Elsa and Rolf were stunned by this news. They did not know how to react or what to do in this situation. Rolf remained silent, trying to hide his confusion, for he himself had created this legendary herb from the plants he and Elsa had collected. These items were extremely valuable, and Rolf realized that if people found out about his ability to create such things with his skill, it could turn into big trouble. Scary images were already flashing through his mind. He imagined that he and Elsa would be enslaved, doing the bidding of cruel owners who would use their abilities for their own selfish purposes. Almani, seeing their anxiety, tried to reassure Rolf. He assured them that the buyer was a reliable man who could be trusted. But suddenly, to the surprise of everyone, Almani revealed that the man was Red-Eyed Bernard. At that moment, someone appeared behind them. Turning around, Rolf and Elsa saw a woman who exclaimed with a smile that there were adorable children standing in front of her. It was Vanessa, the great blue enchantress. She scrutinized Rolf and Elsa, her gaze expressing interest and curiosity. Vanessa declared that since they were able to find such valuable medicinal herbs, it meant that they had extraordinary strength and talents. Rolf, noticing the surprise on Elsa's face, explained to her that Vanessa was Bernard's partner. It suddenly occurred to him that if Vanessa was here, Bernard himself must be somewhere nearby. As a confirmation of his thoughts, a huge rabbit approached them. Its size was so impressive that even in this magical world it looked unusual. Rishi, seeing this miracle, started barking loudly, jumping around the rabbit. It was red-eyed Bernard. His eyes, deep and penetrating, instantly caught Ralph's attention. There was something hypnotizing about them that made them forget everything around them. Bernard asked them to calm the puppy down, and Elsa immediately ordered Rishi to stop barking. Rishi obeyed and sat quietly next to Elsa, but his curious eyes continued to follow the huge rabbit. Vanessa walked over to Bernard and, pointing to Ralph and Elsa, said that those were the children who had found the medicinal herbs. Bernard examined them carefully, and his gaze was full of interest. Ralph felt his heart beating faster, realizing the significance of this moment. He looked into those red eyes and realized why he was called that. Bernard walked up to Ralph and asked if he had found this herb. Ralph nodded, but modestly stated that they were just lucky to stumble upon it in the forest. Bernard frowned, his eyes flashing with suspicion, but Ralph, looking him straight in the eye, confidently repeated that they had accidentally stumbled upon a clearing with this herb and were themselves amazed at its quality. Bernard's gaze was piercing, as if he were trying to penetrate Ralph's very soul, searching for the slightest sign of a lie. Bernard began to explain that in order to reach such a high level, plants needed to feed on mana from the soil. If the herbs have reached legendary quality, it means that the soil there is unusually rich in mana. He smiled, but there was an underlying threat in his smile, and offered to Ralph to show them the place. The offer was accompanied by the promise of a generous reward. Ralph seemed to hesitate, and finally apologized, saying he could not remember the exact path to the clearing. Bernard pressed his lips together and shook his head with an expression of deep disappointment. He stated that such a place should not go unnoticed and get to anyone. Suddenly, as if determined to change things dramatically, he offered Ralph 3 million guards, then, seeing that it had no effect, increased the amount to 5 million guards. Hearing such huge sums, Ralph was dumbfounded, but realized that he must not give in to this temptation. Vanessa, who was standing nearby, turned to Bernard and reminded him that Ralph could not tell him where the clearing was. As if not hearing her, Bernard upped the ante to 7 million guards. Bernard sighed heavily and said that such a treasure should not be lost in the wilderness. He seemed to be pleading with Ralph, but his face showed the determination and rigidity of a man accustomed to getting his way. Suddenly their conversation was interrupted by a loud voice calling them from behind. It turned out to be Figaro, an important figure in the town, known for his wealth and ambition. Figaro looked at Ralph and Elsa with an appraising eye, exclaimed that it was not worth wasting time on these adventurers, and invited them all to his mansion. His manner was imperious and intolerant of objections. Bernard hesitated as he looked at Figaro, but he could not ignore the invitation of so powerful a man. Figaro, without waiting for Bernard's consent, went on to say that today he was giving a banquet in his honor, and everyone would be able to see his greatness. This statement was both a compliment and an order. Ralph and Elsa felt uncomfortable under this attention. Almani, realizing the tension of the situation, quickly agreed to escort the guests to the mansion. Meanwhile, Rishi, a small black wolf cub, felt threatened by Figaro's presence and began to growl. Figaro, hearing this, looked at the puppy with disdain and demanded that Ralph subdue his pet. Elsa quickly calmed Rishi by ordering him to stop growling. Figaro approached Bernard and patted him on the shoulder. His movements were confident and slightly aggressive. He motioned for Bernard to come with him, but he didn't want to interrupt his conversation with Ralph. Figaro, however, was persistent. He took Bernard by the elbow and gently but firmly took him aside, telling him that Ralph and Elsa were not worth his time. Bernard tried to object, but Figaro interrupted him, convincing him that their time would be better spent in more pleasant company, away from these adventurers. Elsa watched this scenario with a slight smile. When Figaro and Bernard withdrew, she quietly remarked that sometimes even Figaro could be useful. Ralph laughed with her, feeling relieved that they had managed to avoid a more tense conversation with Bernard. Ralph, remembering the need to find lodging for the night, turned to Elsa and said that they needed to decide where to stay for the night. He knelt down beside Rishi, who wagged his tail faithfully, and remarked that they would not be allowed into the inn with the wolf cub. Elsa nodded, realizing that they would have to find a place to camp. She then smiled and asked Ralph what he thought about a little camping. Ralph was surprised, but the idea seemed reasonable to him. Elsa pointed out that they would then be harder to find outside the city, and Ralph agreed. He himself did not want to run into Bernard and his partner again. They decided to go to the guild and take an assignment that would give them an excuse to leave the city. At the guild, Ralph and Elsa chose a dungeon clearing assignment that involved killing goblins and gathering medicinal herbs. This task seemed appropriate for them to avoid unnecessary attention. After a while, fully equipped, they set off on their trek. After setting up the tent, Ralph began to put on Rizi the new, beautiful, black collar he had bought especially for the wolf cub. Rizi ran around happily, sniffing everything and occasionally barking with delight. Elsa had finished cooking dinner, and the aromas of freshly cooked food filled the air. Ralph, sitting by the fire, looked at the food with admiration and exclaimed that it looked very appetizing. They began to enjoy their dinner, and Ralph noted that Elsa always managed to find so much delicious food, even in the most unexpected places. Rizi was also pleased with his portion, greedily eating the food. Elsa, with a smile and a wink to Ralph, stated that just as she said, she was confident in her bow skills. At times like this, Ralph realized how lucky he was to have such a loyal friend and associate like Elsa by his side. The night in the forest was quiet and peaceful. Only the sounds of nocturnal animals and the crackling of the fire broke the silence. Ralph and Elsa sat by the fire, thinking about the day's events. Ralph suggested that Elsa go to the lake tomorrow to gather some healing herbs. Elsa, smiling, nodded and agreed, noting that they should go to bed early, for tomorrow would require a lot of energy to complete their tasks. The flames of the fire softly lit their faces, creating a cozy atmosphere amidst the silence of the forest at night. Suddenly, Elsa turned to Ralph, her eyes glowing with thoughtfulness. She carefully whispered that she had a request for him. Ralph looked at her in surprise, waiting to see what she would say. Elsa, as if gathering her wits, lay down on his lap and quietly told him that as a child, she had always fallen asleep on her father's lap. Her voice was filled with warm memories and she asked Ralph to let her repeat the ritual. He, feeling a sudden rush of tenderness, gently stroked her head, and Elsa, closing her eyes, soon sank into the world of dreams. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to break through the fabric of the tent, Ralph was suddenly awoken by strange growls and sounds. Sleepily opening his eyes, he listened for a few moments, trying to figure out the source of the disturbance. The sounds became more and more distinct and insistent. He quickly jumped out of the tent and, spotting a worried Rizi, realized that something was wrong. Rizi, wary and growling, was staring at one point. Elsa, awakened by Ralph's screams, panicked and climbed out of the tent and stood beside him. They were both stunned to see a group of people in front of them. In front of them stood Godot with several escorts. Godot disdainfully announced that they had been kicked out of the Golden Lions because of Ralph and Elsa. Arya, standing beside him, angrily added that they were now going to find out what it was like to be banished. Ralph recognized them and realized that they had come to avenge the past incident. Godot, with fury in his eyes, ordered Ralph to apologize. Godot repeated his order to apologize and confessed that they had deceived Mr. Figaro. He added that if Ralph asked them to return to the guild, maybe they would spare them. Ralph, clutching his sword in his hands, confidently stated that they had not deceived Figaro and were not going to apologize for something they had not done. When the convoys heard Ralph's denial, they rushed furiously to the attack, shrieking and screaming that he would die. One of the attackers swung his sword sharply at Ralph, but he easily deflected the attack, then shattered the enemy's sword with his own, breaking the weapon apart. Another convoy, hoping for surprise, tried to strike Ralph from behind, but was immediately stopped by an aptly struck shield. A few seconds later, all of the attackers lay on the ground, stunned by Ralph's strength and speed. They pondered in amazement as to where he got so much power and skill. Outraged and puzzled, they began shouting Godot's name, calling for his help. Godot, picking up a heavy club from the ground, noticed that their opponent must have gained strength from their last encounter. After carefully examining Ralph's sword and noticing its sharp blade, Godot decided to attack, heading straight for Ralph with the express purpose of killing him. Ralph realized that this was inevitable given Godot's experience and mastery of the sword-peaking skill. However, he was ready to fight. Their swords clashed with force and erupted with sparks, each blow accompanied by a tense shout. The convoys, seeing how Ralph handled Godot, began to proclaim loudly that Ralph was not worth their opponent and was still a mere lowlife. Ralph, hearing this, was outraged. Godot, approaching him, whispered in his ear that he was only a weakling. The next moment Godot struck, knocking the sword out of Ralph's hands. The weapon fell and stuck into the ground, and Rolf staggered back from the unexpected turn of events. Elsa stood alert, holding her bow drawn and taking aim at Gado. Suddenly, she felt movement at her back and heard some rustling. Rolf, noticing a thorny branch coming towards her, shouted, trying to warn her. At the same moment, the branch wrapped around Elsa's body, squeezing her tighter and tighter. Arya, dissatisfied with her entourage, irritatedly declared that her subordinates were hopeless and unable to cope even with weaklings like Rolf and Elsa. The convoys, hearing Arya's reproaches, felt humiliated, for their leader had achieved the golden rank by his example, and they were incapable of handling the task at hand. The branches continued to squeeze Elsa, who began to gasp. Godot, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, shouted at Arya, warning her that she would kill the girl if she didn't stop. Suddenly, the sharp blade of the sword cut through the thorny branches, freeing Elsa. The sudden appearance of Vanessa and Bernard came as a complete surprise to everyone present. The atmosphere changed instantly when Arya, looking angrily at Vanessa, shouted, accusing her of destroying her magic. Vanessa, with a slight smile on her face, calmly replied that her magic looked nice and she had something special for Arya. A second later, she conjured cat ears with her magic, which immediately appeared on Arya's head. Vanessa warned her that if she couldn't break this spell, she would be left with the ears forever. Arya couldn't believe her eyes and started touching her new cat ears. She was overcome with terror. Meanwhile, Bernard turned his attention to Rolf and Elsa. He reported that there were many different rumors about them and he was curious, so he decided to go after them. Turning to Godot, Bernard offered to leave Elsa and Rolf alone in exchange for his promise to forget everything he had seen. Gado, hearing Bernard's offer and realizing that the situation was getting out of hand, nodded in agreement. He took a few steps back, gloomily looking at Rolf and Elsa, and said that he would have another word with Figaro before taking any further action. It was something of a promise or even a threat, leaving them in suspense as to what might follow. At this point, Rolf, realizing that the conflict was temporarily over, turned to Bernard and thanked him profusely for his help. Bernard, with a slight smile, replied that there was no need to thank him, for he too was looking for Rolf. His eyes scrutinized Rolf and Elsa, assessing their condition and fighting skills. He seemed to have already made some important decision. Bernard offered to continue the negotiations he had started. His interest in Rolf and Elsa was not just idle curiosity. He set out to convince them of his proposal, which he believed could change their lives for the better, and suggested that they become adventurous traders. He explained that their skills in combat and wilderness survival could be extremely useful to his cause. Bernard knew that people like Rolf and Elsa could be indispensable partners. Rolf, still under the impression of the recent fight and rescue, looked at Bernard in surprise. Bernard's proposal sounded tempting and promising, especially after all they had been through. Rolf and Elsa exchanged glances, trying to make an important decision. They realized that they were facing a choice: to continue leading a life full of battles and constant threats, or to try something new that could bring them stability and even some peace of mind. Bernard stated that they were willing to help Rolf and Elsa in their endeavors. He then turned to the others and suggested that they end the discussion in this place, inviting everyone to go to his room. Elsa, looking at Rolf with curiosity, asked what they should do next. Rolf suggested that perhaps Bernard and his companion wanted to know about that legendary herb they were hunting for. He added that since the task was done, we might as well go with them. Elsa agreed, but she was still curious as to why it was adventurer traders that they wanted them. Rolf didn't know the answer and suggested keeping his special skills a secret for now, to which Elsa nodded. After a short journey, they came to a huge train, which turned out to be the very number Bernard was talking about. Rolf was stunned that this impressive train was their meeting place. Bernard invited them aboard and they stepped inside. The interior of the train was astonishing in its size and opulence. Bernard embarrassingly motioned for them to go on, explaining that he uses this train as a resting place and as a warehouse to store his treasures. He also mentioned that the train was equipped with 10 horses ready for any challenge. Bernard proudly revealed that the hull of his train was made of mithril ore, one of the strongest and rarest materials in the world. This made the train virtually invulnerable to the attacks of any monsters that might meet in their path. Bernard led them deep into the interior of the train, where there were vast storage rooms filled with many barrels and crates. Vanessa looked around and sarcastically remarked that it was no wonder Bernard was poor, since he had invested all his money in this train. However, she also noted that they now had a cozy nest of comfort and spacious beds. Bernard motioned for Rolf and Elsa to sit down, and when they were settled on the soft couches, he began a conversation. Vanessa added that no one could overhear them in this place, which only added to the sense of security. Rolf assumed that their conversation partners wanted to know about the medicinal herbs they were collecting, but Bernard suddenly stated that he was not interested in that, which surprised Rolf. Suddenly, in the silence of the cozy carriage, Bernard calmly but with obvious interest stated that he was only interested in one thing: Rolf's skill. These words sounded sudden and sharp, like lightning striking in a cloudless sky. Rolf and Elsa, clearly dumbfounded by this confession, were silent for a moment, not knowing how to properly answer such a direct question. Their gazes met, and anxiety and incomprehension flashed in Elsa's eyes. Bernard, without waiting for their reaction, continued, explaining that Mr. Figaro had told him about everything. He said that to the best of his knowledge, Rolf did indeed have a very rare regeneration skill that was of great value. Rolf, slightly embarrassed, nodded in agreement. However, immediately afterwards, his shoulders slumped, and he lowered his head and admitted that despite having this skill, he had never been able to activate it. A deep bitterness resounded in his voice as he explained that this was the reason for his expulsion from the Golden Lion Guild. Bernard listened attentively, but his face remained impenetrable. He said that he had already heard about it and asked how things were now. His words sounded as if he knew much more than he was showing. He continued, explaining that he knew not only about Rolf's banishment, but also how he and Elsa had defeated Ogre, found medicinal herbs, and even discovered a new dungeon. His every word seemed to penetrate to the very core of the events they had experienced. Rolf and Elsa exchanged astonished glances. They could not believe that Bernard knew so many details about their recent adventures. Bernard, noticing their surprise, continued to look Rolf straight in the eye, emphasizing the significance of each word. He noted that Rolf and Elsa were the ones involved in all of these events, making them key figures in the chain of recent events. Bernard noticed that Rolf and Elsa had changed in the last few days, and this change made him suspicious. He looked at them more closely and began to guess that some unusual circumstances were behind it. Bernard frankly admitted that he did not believe the story that they had accidentally stumbled upon the legendary herbs. In his opinion, it was simply impossible. His gaze stopped on Rolf, and he bluntly stated that it was Rolf who had improved the herb with his rare skill. Rolf stood silently in front of him, not knowing how to reply. He felt exposed and vulnerable. Elsa was confused, for they hadn't shown anyone how Rolf's skill worked. However, Bernard, after watching them for several days, was able to guess everything. Rolf, looking at Bernard, began to realize that this world was full of legendary heroes, such as the red-eyed Bernard, whose abilities and skills exceeded all expectations. Suddenly, Rolf nodded and asked to be allowed to talk to Elsa alone. Bernard, realizing the importance of the moment, immediately agreed. Rolf and Elsa got off the train, leaving Bernard in thought. Elsa, barely containing her excitement, remarked that they were amazing for being able to guess his skill immediately. Rolf, taking her hand, calmly explained that this was exactly what he wanted to talk to her about. They exchanged glances full of understanding and support. After a few minutes, they walked back to the carriage. Bernard, noticing their appearance, expressed surprise that they had ended their conversation so quickly. Rolf and Elsa sat down in their seats, and Rolf, plucking up courage, declared that he was ready to show his skill, but on one condition: it must remain secret. Bernard, with seriousness and respect, agreed to his terms. Rolf looked at Bernard with curiosity and asked him if any object was broken. Bernard, unexpectedly, became interested in the matter, thinking about possible cases of breakages. Vanessa, finding herself suddenly the center of attention, recalled the morning's incident with the broken cup. She went to the table to bring Rolf the shards. Rolf, expressing his gratitude to Vanessa, carefully examined the broken cup, and then turned to Elsa and took her hand. The next moment, Elsa touched the cup with her fingers and caused her destruction skill to activate. It shattered into many shards. Bernard was amazed at what he saw, and Rolf explained that Elsa had a unique gift that allowed her to destroy objects with just one touch. This ability, as it turns out, is not only an unusual phenomenon, but also a serious limitation for Elsa. Vanessa, as she listened to Rolf's explanation, realized that even everyday things, such as walking without gloves or touching objects with her bare hands, were becoming difficult and problematic for Elsa. These words made Elsa lower her head, feeling a little isolated because of her special gift. Rolf, noticing her confusion, smiled encouragingly and pointed out that he could touch her without any repercussions. He gently took her hand, and Bernard and Vanessa were stunned. This went against everything they had just learned. At this moment, while holding her hand, Ralph activated his own skill. The cup that had been shattered into ashes began to slowly recover. The shards were fusing together, returning it to its former appearance, as if time had been reversed. Bernard watched it with incomprehension and admiration, unable to believe what was happening before his eyes. Ralph began to explain his abilities with confidence in his voice. He revealed that his unique skill is called Regeneration. This ability allows him to cancel out the destructive effects of Elsa's skill by returning objects to their original state. Bernard, immersed in his thoughts, pondered over what he had heard, trying to understand the depth of this information. Ralph, seeing his confusion, continued his explanation. He told him that his ability not only restored destroyed objects, but also allowed him to see their true value. Looking at the restored cup, he easily determined that it was made of rare ceramic glass and was worth at least 10,000 gold. Bernard's eyes lit up as if he suddenly realized something important hidden in those words. Ralph continued, adding that his ability could not be activated on its own. It only works in combination with Elsa's destructive skill, forming a synergistic effect. He also explained that his skill not only restored items, but could also raise their level, improving their properties and quality. Bernard, amazed by what he heard, admitted that he had never heard of such a thing before. Ralph continued his explanation by giving examples. He described how he had used his skill on medicinal herbs, improving their healing properties. Those herbs, after being exposed to his ability, became much more effective and useful. Bernard, listening to this, nodded slowly, realizing the power and potential of such a skill. Vanessa, who had been listening attentively until now, suddenly smiled and remarked that their joint skill looked very romantic. However, Ralph looked at her seriously and emphasized that his ability carried certain dangers. He explained that he could create legendary items from the most ordinary things. Hearing this, Bernard suddenly realized that such an ability could become an object of desire and be used for military purposes if it was found out. Ralph nodded, confirming his hunch. Bernard suddenly realized that if Ralph started selling his unique magic-created items, it would inevitably attract unnecessary attention. People would want to know where he got such items from and who was behind it. Ralph, as if reading Bernard's mind, confidently announced that he and Elsa had already discussed the matter. He explained that they agreed to become adventurous traders and sell their wares, but with one important condition: they would do so solely with Bernard's help and guidance. Bernard, realizing the gravity of the situation, nodded in agreement. Ralph decided to share part of his story with them. He told them that his parents, his father and mother, were also adventurers. When he was young, they took an assignment at the guild and went on a long journey. Since then, Ralph believes that even now, his parents continue to explore the world. That is why he decided to become an adventurer himself, not only to see the world, but perhaps to meet them. This story evoked deep emotions from everyone, and the atmosphere in the room became even more intense. Suddenly, Ralph, gathering his courage, appealed to Bernard to let him join their group. His eyes shone with determination and there was sincere hope in his voice. Bernard, sensing this sincerity, agreed without hesitation, feeling that this man would be a valuable ally. Turning to Elsa, Bernard asked if she had any objection to this decision. Elsa, smiling, stated with warmth in her voice that she would always be by Ralph's side, supporting him in any endeavor. Elsa then gently took the little wolf cub named Reese in her arms and added with a soft smile that he too would be part of their team. Reese, as if understanding the importance of the moment, whimpered softly, snuggling into her arms. Vanessa came closer and gently stroked the wolf cub and expressed her joy at meeting the new member of their group, admiring his fluffy coat and adorable eyes. However, Vanessa soon suddenly turned her attention to a more practical problem. She noticed that there were only 2 beds in their humble hideaway. With a mischievous smile on her lips, she announced that this meant Bernard would be sleeping with her. Bernard, stunned by this frankness, froze, not knowing what to say. Vanessa, ignoring his embarrassment, continued, addressing Ralph and Elsa. She suggested that they take Bernard's bed, which had been left vacant. Ralph, realizing that he and Elsa would have to sleep together, felt his cheeks blush. He tried to hide his embarrassment, but Vanessa, noticing this, excitedly asked him if he was embarrassed. Ralph, not knowing where to keep his eyes, mumbled something inaudible, and Vanessa giggled merrily, enjoying his reaction. Elsa suddenly shifted her gaze to Bernard and Vanessa, and a little embarrassed, asked if they were married by any chance. Bernard was stunned by such an unexpected question and froze, not knowing what to say. Vanessa, on the other hand, without losing her composure, said with a smile that they were not married yet, but she was not at all against it. However, according to her, Bernard is not ready for such a step yet, and she herself is busy studying magic. Bernard, recovering a little from the surprise, added that they are colleagues, and even if they get married, nothing in their relationship and work together will change. Elsa, understanding and accepting their position, nodded. At that moment, Vanessa came up behind Bernard and hugged him, feeling the warmth of his body through his clothes. She gently asked what he wanted for dinner, lightly teasing him with her close presence. Bernard, feeling the blood rush to his cheeks from embarrassment, asked her to stop. Vanessa, enjoying his reaction, started to leave the room, glancing at Elsa and asking if she wanted to help with dinner preparations. Elsa, happily agreeing, followed her, leaving Rolf alone. When Rolf was banished from the Golden Lions, he thought his career as an adventurer was over forever. However, he was now in the same group with the world-famous adventurer Bernard, feeling part of something bigger. They had dinner together, and Rolf realized that he could not have dreamed of such a development. Each day he became more and more convinced that exciting new adventures lay ahead of them, and his heart filled with anticipation. The next morning, opening his eyes, Rolf felt something soft next to his face. He looked around and was surprised to realize that it was Reese, nestled right next to his head. Rolf got up from the bed and saw Reese immediately move to the vacant half of the bed, snuggling up next to Elsa. At that moment, Vanessa entered the room, greeting Rolf with a good morning. He greeted her back, still not fully awake. Vanessa, noticing his serious expression, smiled and said that it was a man's duty to take responsibility. Rolf, slightly confused, did not understand what responsibility she was talking about. Vanessa, stepping closer to Elsa, said with a smile that she would never believe that Rolf had not done anything to her during the night. Rolf blushed, feeling his embarrassment growing. At that moment, Bernard approached them and discreetly ordered Vanessa to stop teasing Rolf. Vanessa, with a slightly resentful look at Bernard, suddenly asked what that noise was last night. Bernard, as if not understanding what she was talking about, shrugged his shoulders. At that moment, Elsa woke up from their conversations and got out of bed, trying to figure out what was going on. Vanessa, noticing her awakening, suggested that everyone go to the bathroom and take a shower to freshen up before starting a new day. She, lightly ruffling Bernard's hair, made him embarrassedly ask her to stop. Bernard, still trying to recover, stated that he did not want to go into the shower again and asked Vanessa to stop her antics. He even shouted that he would get angry if she continued, but it sounded comical rather than threatening. At this point, Reese's loud snoring filled the room and everyone laughed, realizing that a new day full of adventures and challenges lay ahead of them. Thus began Elsa and Rolf's first day as traders. They looked at each other with a smile, feeling that great things lay ahead of them. Their journey was just beginning and they were determined to go forward, supporting each other in every situation. With each step they grew closer and their bond grew stronger, turning them into a true team ready for any challenge. Figaro stood carefully rubbing his new armor, its surface glistening in the morning sunlight. His face lit up with a satisfied smile, reflecting an inner calm and confidence. Suddenly one of the escorts burst into the room, his eyes full of terror, and he shouted that there was trouble. Figaro, instantly alert, turned round and demanded an explanation. The convoy, out of breath, began to ramble on, saying something about Rolf, and his words attracted everyone's attention. A little earlier, Rolf and Bernard had entered the guild, attracting the gazes of everyone present. The girl behind the counter, accustomed to all sorts of inquiries, clearly did not expect to hear what came out of their mouths. She confusedly asked to clarify their request again. The girl carefully read the document that stated that Rolf's group had decided to become merchants and joined Bernard's group. She looked up at them, her gaze full of bewilderment. Bernard, standing beside Rolf, confidently confirmed her words, which further increased the surprise of the surrounding people. Whispers of disbelief spread throughout the hall. Everyone who heard the news couldn't believe their ears. They couldn't understand how could Rolf, with his seemingly useless skill, convince Bernard to accept him into his group. The girl, trying to hide her surprise, smiled and invited Rolf to put his signature on the document. Rolf, with a slight tremor in his hands, was about to raise his hand when suddenly someone stopped him. It was Figaro, His sudden appearance caused a wave of whispers and tension in the hall. Figaro, with a stern expression on his face, walked towards Bernard and, glaring at him, asked him if he was sane. He loudly declared that Rolf was not suitable for their group as he was unable to even activate his skill. Figaro continued, calling Rolf complete rubbish and claiming that he would be of no use to the group. Bernard, trying to remain calm, firmly stated that Rolf would join their group as a porter. He emphasized that there was nothing objectionable about it. Figaro, unable to understand how Bernard could make such a decision, irritatedly stated that anyone could be found for the job of porter, and Rolf would only dishonor their honor with his false promises and inability to be useful. These words made Rolf very angry, for he had never lied to anyone and had always tried to be honest. Bernard, noticing the rage in Rolf's eyes, emphatically stated that Figaro was wrong. He recalled that Rolf had been kicked out of the Golden Lions and that was why he had decided to accept him into his group of merchants. Bernard believed in Rolf's potential and wanted to give him a chance to prove his worth. He knew that everyone deserves a second chance, especially someone who has already experienced hardship and injustice. Figaro, with a stern expression on his face, looked at Bernard and firmly invited him to join the Golden Lions Guild. His offer sounded impressive and his voice was full of confidence. However, Bernard, remaining calm, said that he still had a lot of unfinished business and apologized. He added that he could not accept such a generous offer. There was a surprised whisper in the hall, for no one had expected such an answer. Everyone knew that refusing the invitation to the Golden Lions was an unheard of act. Everyone around them froze in anticipation as Bernard firmly reiterated that he could not accept Figaro's offer. The faces of those around him expressed utter amazement, for no one would have refused the opportunity to join such a prestigious guild. Figaro, feeling his ego pricked, nodded and remarked that Bernard apparently did not take his guild seriously at all. He added sarcastically that apparently a little wealth had already turned Bernard's head, making him think of himself as nothing. Figaro, with obvious irritation in his voice, said that in that case he wanted to make an official statement. From that moment on, the Forsen family ceased any dealings with the Bernard group. The hall fell silent, and all eyes were fixed on this dramatic scene. Figaro tried to deal with his anger by clenching his fists, and without saying another word, walked out of the guild, slamming the door loudly. Rolf, worried about what had happened, looked at Bernard and asked if everything would be alright. Bernard, trying to reassure him, explained that the head of the Forsen family was Figaro's father, and even if they couldn't reach an agreement with them, they still had many other trading partners. With a slight chuckle he added that he shouldn't worry too much about it, and suggested that he let Figaro indulge his ego a little. The girl behind the counter, seeing that the tension was gradually subsiding, suggested that they continue with the paperwork. Rolf nodded with gratitude in his eyes, feeling the warmth of support from his new comrades. He took a deep breath, gathering all his strength and determination, and confidently signed the document. This act symbolized his official entry into the adventurous merchant group. The girl behind the counter, seeing his determination, smiled and congratulated Rolf, saying that he was now officially recognized in this status. Bernard, standing next to him, gave him his hand, his face expressing confidence and hope for fruitful cooperation. Rolf shook his hand firmly, feeling the strength and support in that gesture. This moment was a milestone for him on his new path. They exchanged firm glances, full of determination and confidence in the future. Bernard leaned on the counter and turned with a serious expression to the girl who stood behind the guild counter. Her eyes read the experience and confidence that comes with years of working in a place like this. Bernard, trying not to lose his resolve, politely asked if they had any magic crystals available. The girl, without losing her professionalism, frowned her eyebrows thoughtfully. She pulled out several thick books and documents from under the counter, beginning to peruse them carefully. After a few minutes, she looked up and reported that the warehouse now held about 3,000 magic crystals. Even Bernard, who was used to big deals, was slightly surprised. But he quickly mastered himself and, smiling, declared that he was buying them all. The girl, clearly not expecting such a large order, froze for a moment, trying to realize what she had heard. Her eyes widened with surprise, but she quickly returned to her professional calm and nodded politely. Bernard asked to handle the crystals with care, specifying that each would cost 300 guard and asked if they were satisfied with that amount. The girl nodded again and asked him to wait a little while to draw up all the necessary paperwork. At this time, Rolf, who was standing nearby, looked at Bernard with some concern and asked if everything was alright, for such a large amount of crystals seemed excessive to him. Bernard, with a soft smile on his face, explained that when Rolf absorbed the power of these crystals, he would be able to develop his regeneration skill. He assured Rolf that this was an important investment in his future. These words gave Rolf a deep sense of gratitude, and he was about to thank Bernard when suddenly, someone approached them. It was the guild master, Mr. Fran. Fran, a man of imposing appearance, with wise eyes and a commanding posture, greeted them. He smiled discreetly and asked Bernard if he really intended to buy all the magic crystals. Bernard confirmed his words. Fran then led Bernard to a corner of the warehouse where several massive barrels stood in the semi-darkness, filled to the top with shimmering magic crystals. The light from them reflected softly on the wooden walls of the warehouse, creating a mysterious and enchanting atmosphere. Fran, slightly lowering his voice, explained that the guild didn't really know how to use these crystals. He added that if they were just thrown away, wild animals might get to them and turn into dangerous monsters. Bernard confidently assured Fran that they would handle the crystals with great care and caution. Fran, scrutinizing the expression on Bernard's and Ralph's faces, asked with a slight suspicion in his voice to explain why they needed so many crystals. Ralph, sensing the tension, wondered what Bernard would say in response. However, Bernard, remaining calm, firmly stated that he would find good uses for the crystals, but unfortunately he could not reveal all the details because he was fulfilling the request of an acquaintance. Fran, apparently satisfied with the answer, smiled slightly and said that he trusted Bernard completely. He promised to prepare all the necessary documents and crystals for the transfer. Bernard thanked Fran for his cooperation and asked him to withdraw the payment for the crystals from his personal guild account. Fran, with a discreet nod, began to write down the necessary data. However, before Bernard could step back, Fran suddenly called out to him. His eyes read seriousness and persistence as he informed him that he had a small request. Fran, lowering his voice, explained that a new dungeon had recently been discovered near the city. Since then, monsters had started appearing in the vicinity, and he wanted to find out as much information as possible about this dungeon. He added that Bernard, the only platinum-ranked adventurer in this city, was the only one capable of fulfilling this request. Franz asked if he could count on his help, and his voice sounded like a call to action. Bernard and Ralph exchanged glances and thought about exploring the dungeon. They realized that it would not be an easy task, requiring serious preparation. Bernard listened carefully to Fran, thought for a moment, and then firmly stated that he agreed to accept the offer. However, he asked for some time to prepare, realizing that such a mission required careful preparation and strategic planning. As a reward for completing the mission, Bernard requested 3 million gardas, and if the mission was successfully completed, he offered to raise the amount to 4 million. Fran, appreciating the reasonableness of the demands, nodded and promised to prepare everything necessary for this difficult mission. Fran, expressing his gratitude for Bernard's agreement, added that he would also like to reward Ralph for his significant contribution to the discovery of the dungeon. He emphasized that with Ralph's information, the exploration could be greatly accelerated and more successful. Fran offered Ralph 2.5 million guards and the right to take whatever they find in the dungeon. Moreover, if the dungeon was successfully cleared, Fran promised to pay an additional 3 million guards, which made the offer even more tempting. Bernard, realizing the importance and benefit of this offer, immediately agreed. He realized that it was not only a great opportunity for the group, but also a chance for Ralph to prove himself and develop his skills. Ralph looked at Bernard and nodded gratefully and offered to guide him through the dungeon, using his information and knowledge of the area to successfully complete the task. Bernard, appreciating the significance of the assistance offered, nodded again and stated that they accepted the request. Fran thanked them for their determination and willingness to accept the challenge. In his eyes he read relief and hoped that this was the team that would be up to the task. At this time, Arya was watching closely, lurking in the shadows. Her eyes glittered with curiosity and slight anxiety. She watched their every move and listened to every word, realizing that Ralph and Bernard had serious trials ahead of them. Arya knew that these events could dramatically change their lives, and was determined to follow them to be a part of these important events. Ralph stacked the barrels of crystals one by one, his hands gliding confidently over the smooth wooden surfaces, carefully setting them in place. Each crystal was important, each barrel a precious cargo that could play a crucial role in their future. Time passed imperceptibly, and finally, having finished loading, Ralph stepped off the train. His face was covered with a slight sweat, but his eyes glowed with satisfaction at the work he had done. As he approached Bernard, he calmly announced that the loading of the crystals was complete. Bernard, with gratitude in his eyes, thanked Rolf for his labor. He realized how important this part of their mission was, and appreciated Rolf's diligence. Bernard then reminded him that Vanessa and Elsa had gone to the gun shop, and suggested that he join them. Bernard, deciding that preparing for the journey required a serious investment, pulled a small bag of money out of his pocket and handed it to Rolf. Weighing it in his palm, Rolf felt the weight of the coins, which symbolized Bernard's trust and support. A sense of gratitude flashed in his eyes, and he mentally promised to honor that trust. Bernard asked Rolf to use the money to prepare for their upcoming journey, realizing that every member of their team needed to be well equipped. Rolf, after thanking Bernard for his generosity and trust, hesitated for a moment, and then asked if he could buy a used gun. This question caused Bernard momentary confusion. He did not immediately understand why Rolf, given the opportunity to buy a new and shiny weapon, would prefer something old and used. But there was a certainty and familiarity read in the question that made Bernard wonder. Rolf looked at him with such confidence that Bernard felt his doubts gradually dissipate. There was something in that look that convinced Bernard that Rolf had made the right decision. Perhaps he had his own reasons based on experience or knowledge, which Bernard did not yet understand. In the end, he decided to trust his mate and gave his consent, allowing Rolf to buy whatever he saw fit. Rolf felt joy and relief. It was important to him that his choices and decisions were made with understanding and support. He knew that his upcoming assignment as a merchant and adventurer required not only skill but also the right equipment. After gathering their thoughts, they headed in the direction of the armory. On the way, Rolf pondered his choice. He imagined selecting swords and daggers, testing their balance, sharpness, and comfort. Rolf entered the armory and was immediately accosted. Apologizing for the delay, he looked up and froze with surprise. Elsa and Vanessa stood before him in revealing outfits that were clearly not meant for battle. Vanessa, smiling, asked Rolf if he thought Elsa looked good in her new outfit. Rolf, stunned by such an unexpected sight, instantly turned away, feeling his face flush with color. He tried to figure out why they had dressed like that, but his thoughts were confused. Vanessa, noticing his confusion, explained that she just wanted to dress Elsa up a little and add some variety to their routine. Then, still smiling, she offered to wait for them outside to allow them to concentrate on choosing weapons. Rolf and Elsa nodded, and Vanessa left them to go outside. Left alone, Rolf and Elsa returned to their main task. After a while, Rolf had already picked up a few weapons and carefully placed them on the counter. The gunsmith, seeing their selection, smiled welcomingly and started a conversation. He mentioned that he had heard that they were now merchants under Mr. Bernard and offered to give them a special discount. The armorer looked closely at the old swords and daggers that Rolf had placed on the counter and, raising his eyebrows in surprise, asked why they needed such old weapons, offering new, shiny blades instead. Rolf, looking at him confidently, declared that they were quite content with such. The armorer, noticing the determination in Rolf's eyes, remarked that they were strange fellows, but honored customers. Rolf, thanking the gunsmith for the offer, decided to look at some other things. Rolf continued to examine the rows of weapons arranged along the walls of the shop. His gaze lingered on one corner, where many old, shabby swords, daggers, and other weapons lay strewn about. There were considerably more of them than on his previous visit. The armorer, noticing Rolf's interest, came closer and explained that when adventurers came for new weapons, they often left their old ones behind so as not to carry extra weight. After a short thought, Rolf declared that he would take all of those old weapons. The armorer was surprised at such an unusual decision, his eyes widening in surprise. Rolf, noticing the gunsmith's surprise, nodded and explained that Mr. Bernard had asked him to acquire as many weapons as possible. The armorer, still amazed, became interested and asked why they needed so many old weapons. Rolf, smiling, replied that it was for one nobleman. There was a note of confidence in his voice, and he realized that such a reason would sound plausible enough. The armorer, sensing Rolf's sincerity, expressed his understanding and suggested that perhaps Rolf and Bernard were raising an army for themselves. He smiled as he imagined their troop equipping many warriors with these weapons. Rolf, for his part, explained that all nobles are the same in their aspirations just as long as it is bigger and cheaper. There was a slight irony in these words, and the armorer, realizing this, laughed merrily. The armorer stated that he would prepare everything for transport and began to prepare documents, and calculations. After a while, Rolf and Elsa returned to Bernard's train. Rolf, slightly out of breath, immediately apologized for the wait, but his apology was interrupted by Bernard, who remarked approvingly that they had done a good job. Rolf was followed by a cart filled with crates stuffed to the top with a variety of weapons and equipment. Bernard, examining their purchases, noted that they had indeed bought a lot, and asked how much it had all cost. Rolf, smiling slightly, replied that all the purchases had cost only 600,000 guards. Bernard nodded in satisfaction and complimented Rolf on his business skills. He noted that Rolf was beginning to show the skills of a true merchant. Elsa, standing nearby, also praised Rolf, and he laughed embarrassedly, feeling warmth and support from his friends. Inspecting the wagon, Vanessa noticed that it contained only equipment and weapons. Her gaze lingered on the empty space where the red dress Elsa had tried on in the shop should have been. Vanessa couldn't contain her curiosity and asked Elsa why she hadn't picked up that beautiful dress. Elsa, smiling slightly, replied that she didn't need it and that such beautiful clothes didn't suit her. There was a note of modesty and insecurity in her voice. Vanessa, not satisfied with this answer, went over to Rolf and whispered quietly in his ear that a good man should indulge a girl's every desire. There was genuine concern for her friend in her words. Then, returning to Elsa, she hugged her and said with a smile that Elsa too must sometimes fulfill her desires. Vanessa asked Bernard to confirm her words, and he agreed without hesitation, saying that nice clothes were never unnecessary. Elsa and Vanessa began to talk, discussing the dress and other outfits, and Rolf, standing aside, finally realized the importance of what Vanessa had said. Rolf, gathering his thoughts, approached Elsa with determination in his eyes. His heart was beating faster, but he was full of confidence. He firmly declared that he would soon become a famous adventurer. Rolf added that he would be sure to buy her anything she wanted. His words sounded like a promise filled with genuine concern and a desire to make her happy. Elsa smiled slightly upon hearing him, her eyes glowing with warmth. She quietly replied that she didn't need all this, but Rolf didn't let her finish. He suddenly shouted that it wouldn't work that way. There was an unwavering conviction in his voice. He stated that she should always wear nice clothes because she deserved it. His words were full of passion and determination. Elsa, embarrassed and touched by his insistence, looked at him with gratitude. At that moment, Vanessa ran up to them and happily announced that she would choose Elsa's own clothes for her. Her eyes shone with enthusiasm and care. Elsa, feeling supported by her friend, thanked her. They began to whisper, discussing details, while Rolf watched them with the hope that Vanessa would choose something dignified and appropriate for Elsa. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Figaro listened intently to Arya, who gave him the latest news. Her voice was quiet but confident when she told him that Bernard's group had gone to the dungeon. Hearing this, Figaro smiled. Something mysterious flashed in his eyes, and he wondered about the possible consequences of this trek. Figaro knew that dungeons held many dangers, but they could also bring incredible riches and power to those who dared to descend into their depths. In a sunny glade surrounded by a dense forest, a majestic deer with graceful antlers was peacefully nibbling on the lush grass. His wet nose groped every leaf, savoring every moment of peace and quiet. But suddenly, his keen hearing caught a loud, sharp sound cutting the silence. The deer froze for a moment, its ears alerted, its eyes widened with fright, and without wasting a second, it swiftly took off, easily overcoming obstacles in its path, like a swift whirlwind. Meanwhile, the heavy wheels of the huge carriage, comparable in size to a train, rumbled and creaked on the stony road, raising clouds of dust. Inside this impressive carriage, made of dark wood and decorated with intricate designs, Bernard's entire group gathered together. Elsa, marveling at the scope and beauty of the vehicle, could not hold back an enthusiastic cry, exclaiming that this carriage was simply magnificent. Rolf, her faithful friend and companion, with a broad smile on his face, supported her opinion, sharing her delight. Vanessa, squinting her eyes slyly, glanced at Bernard and, suppressing a giggle, remarked that this carriage could go even faster. Bernard, with a serious expression, looked at her and nodded in agreement without hesitation. The next moment, as if obeying an invisible order, the carriage accelerated sharply, leaving a long trail of dust behind it, and gathering speed towards their goal, a mysterious and dangerous dungeon hidden in the depths of the forest. The carriage known as the Crimson Way was a truly remarkable vehicle, an example of exquisite engineering. Its design was characterized not only by aesthetics but also by functionality. The occupants of the carriage could enjoy soft cushions and upholstery that cushioned even the most violent jolts on rough roads. Bernard proudly explained that the secret to the smooth ride was the unusually wide wheels, which provided stability and rideability. He also added that the carriage was lightweight thanks to the use of mithril, a rare and expensive metal that they had spent a fortune to acquire. Vanessa, always ready for sarcastic remarks, rolled her eyes and remarked with a wry smile that they had spent more than a fortune. Bernard, realizing the truth of her words, chose not to argue and fell silent. Vanessa, seizing the moment, added that the design of the interior space was to her credit. She proudly emphasized that the comfort of the living quarters was as important as the mobility of the carriage, especially on long journeys. Elsa, admiring the comfort, suggested an idea to Rolf that immediately resonated with his heart. She suggested that he save up some money and buy a carriage like it for himself to create a cozy home for their wolf cub, Reese. Rolf, catching this thought, immediately thought about the prospects. He imagined him and Elsa traveling on a small wagon, enjoying every moment together. The idea seemed wonderful and full of romance to him. Suddenly Elsa noticed that they were approaching the dungeon, and her excitement was transmitted to Rolf. Both, realizing the danger, shouted in unison to Bernard, demanding that he stop the carriage. Bernard, pulling on the reins and straining every muscle, tried to stop the mighty horses that were pulling Crimson Path forward. The wheels of the carriage creaked and the ground beneath them rumbled, but gradually the carriage slowed down, preparing for a new chapter of their adventure at the entrance to the mysterious dungeon. All four of them leisurely stepped out of the carriage, savoring the moment before the challenge ahead. They found themselves at the edge of a forest clearing, where the green grass transitioned smoothly into the dark earth, a reminder of the recent magical storm. Rolf stepped forward first, his gaze stopping at the dark hole in the ground that Elsa had created with her powerful skill not too long ago. He pointed at it, and explained that this was where they had found the entrance to the dungeon hidden deep underground. Bernard, a little behind the others, quietly whispered that they had finally found a new dungeon after so much time of searching and failing. His eyes glowed with excitement, and his hands trembled slightly with anticipation. Vanessa, noticing this, couldn't resist commenting, noting that he was indeed excited. Bernard, smiling, acknowledged her right and explained that such an unexplored dungeon was a rare find, and his soul was burning with anticipation of new discoveries and adventures. Realizing the importance of careful preparation, Bernard suggested that Rolf increase his regeneration level to be ready for any eventuality. Rolf agreed without hesitation, knowing that each enhanced skill could prove crucial in the coming campaign. Elsa, meanwhile, stood by the barrels full of magic crystals and contemplated the amount of effort and money Bernard had put into acquiring them. She realized that these crystals could play a key role in their success and decided not to waste any time. With concentration in her eyes, Elsa began to destroy the crystals one by one, releasing their powerful magical energy. Every time she destroyed a crystal, waves of energy spread around, filling the space with magical light. Rolf absorbed this energy, feeling his strength growing. Suddenly, the system notified him that his regeneration skill had reached level 10, and he had a new skill opened up quantity selection. Vanessa, noticing the sudden change in his behavior, asked what had happened. Rolf explained that he was now seeing numbers over crystals, which opened up new possibilities for him. The number 1 first appeared above the barrel of crystals, which then increased to 2. Bernard, delighted by this discovery, suggested that Rolf try absorbing several crystals at once to test the limit of his new abilities. Rolf concentrated, and suddenly the crystals began to fly powerfully out of the barrel as if obeying his will. Everyone around them was amazed by this spectacle. Elsa, without wasting a second, shattered all the crystals, releasing even more energy. Rolf, feeling his strength increased manifold, realized that he was able to absorb several crystals at the same time thanks to his new skill. Bernard, watching what was happening, realized that this discovery might change their approach to exploring the dungeon. He asked Rolf how many crystals he could absorb at a time. Rolf, scrutinizing the information from the system, noticed that the limit was probably the number 172, as the system had not gone above that number. The system asked Rolf if he wanted to absorb 172 crystals, and he, realizing the importance of this step, agreed. The crystals, as if pulled by magic power, rose from the barrel with incredible speed and rushed towards Elsa. Their movement resembled a furious whirlwind aimed at her. Rolf instantly noticed the danger and loudly warned her. Elsa, displaying lightning-fast reactions, immediately began destroying the crystals with her magic. With each wave of her power, the crystals shattered into small shards that disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only a thin trace of magical energy. This energy swirled towards Rolf, absorbing into his body and filling him with incredible power. Suddenly, Rolf cried out in unbearable pain. His scream pierced the silence of the forest, and his eyes widened with horror and anguish. The next second he collapsed to the ground and everyone rushed to him, panic-stricken and anxious. Bernard, seeing Rolf's suffering, shouted to Vanessa to use healing magic. Vanessa instantly ran over to Rolf, her hands beginning to glow with a soft blue light as she cast healing spells. A few agonizing seconds passed before Rolf, panting, breathed in a full breath. He looked at Vanessa gratefully, his face gradually taking on a calm expression. Elsa, still shaken by what had happened, asked Rolf what had happened. Rolf, gradually regaining consciousness, explained that as soon as he started absorbing the crystals, his body was gripped by unbearable pain, as if thousands of red-hot needles were piercing his every cell. At that moment, the system issued a notification that the maximum number of crystals that could be absorbed in one day had been exceeded. Rolf immediately shared this information with the others, and Bernard hesitated, frowning his eyebrows. Vanessa explained that magic crystals were a concentrate of pure magic energy, and if one absorbed too much at once, it could cause serious consequences to the body. Rolf, agreeing with her, nodded, acknowledging the validity of her words. Elsa ran up to Rolf and hugged him, expressing her deep concern. She confessed that she was very worried about him. Rolf, reassuring her, assured her that everything was all right now and she need not worry. Everyone smiled, feeling relieved, and suggested counting the remaining crystals to see how many more there were to absorb. Vanessa, assuming the role of counter, carefully counted the crystals and announced that there were 2,700 left. Of the original 3,000 crystals, Rolf had managed to absorb 300. Bernard, frowning his eyebrows, pronounced that it appeared that Rolf could safely absorb no more than 299 crystals per day so as not to subject himself to a second bout of pain and exhaustion. Realizing this fact made him realize that it would take 9 days to fully absorb the remaining crystals. Bernard firmly stated that before they could go to the dungeon, Rolf's skill level had to be upgraded, which would take time and effort. Rolf could hardly believe it, his heart clenched at the thought of lost time and missed opportunities. However, Bernard, like a true leader, reminded him that a leader's primary duty was to look after the health and safety of his comrades. He suggested that this time be used for intensive training to prepare for the upcoming dungeon trials. Bernard then firmly and confidently announced that they would start intensive training from tomorrow. His voice sounded resolute, like a commander giving orders to his troops before an important battle. Rolf and Elsa, realizing the seriousness of the task ahead, nodded confidently, agreeing to the plan. They knew that every minute of preparation could be decisive in their upcoming adventure. Vanessa looked up at the sky and noticed that the sun was already slowly sinking below the horizon, coloring the clouds with golden pink hues. Her face lit up in the soft light of the setting sun, and with a smile, she offered everyone dinner. This offer was welcomed with joy and relief, for after such a busy day they all needed to recuperate and enjoy a brief moment of peace. The next morning, as the sun barely illuminated the camp, Rolf felt refreshed. His regeneration skill had reached a new level, and he was determined to test his new abilities. The morning training began under Bernard's strict guidance. The first task was to determine the range of Rolf's skill. Several swords were stuck into the ground, each a certain distance apart. Concentrating, Rolf began to demonstrate his skill. One by one, the swords began to fly into the air, obeying his will. Eventually, they established that the range of the skill was about 10 paces. Vanessa, standing confidently in front of them, suggested the next stage of the training. Behind her, a huge stone golem towered behind her, inspiring fear and respect with its intimidating appearance. She suggested that the training session begin, and Rolf and Elsa, a little horrified, agreed, nodding. The golem began to chase them, breaking everything in its path and forcing them to move with maximum speed and coordination. For 10 minutes they ran, dodging the golem's blows and trying to avoid being hit by its devastating attacks. After an intense warm-up, Vanessa said that they needed to improve their teamwork and suggested that they attack the golem in pairs. Bernard, observing what was happening, noticed that Vanessa was really ruthless in her methods, but it helped to gain combat experience. Vanessa, hearing this, objected loudly so that no one would dare to take offense at her for such cruel training. Everyone agreed, realizing that her methods were paying off. Next came training with Bernard, who taught Rolf and Elsa the art of fencing. They honed the blows, parries, and tactics necessary for successful combat. Elsa, for her part, began her training with a bow, perfecting her marksmanship and shooting speed. The days passed in hard work and dedication, each striving to become better and stronger. After a few days of intense training and constant use of magical energy, Rolf's regeneration level reached 23. This significant improvement brought him a new skill, item synthesis. Vanessa, noticing the change, raised her eyebrows in surprise, and Rolf, reflecting on his past adventures, wondered if the new skill might mean combining several items into one, creating more powerful artifacts. Bernard, always willing to experiment, suggested trying the new skill on the swords they had recently bought specifically for training. Rolf agreed enthusiastically. Elsa took on the task of destroying the swords, preparing them for fusion. Each blow of her magic was accompanied by bright flashes as metal shards flew around in a circle, being absorbed by the magical energy. When the system notified Rolf that one of the iron swords was broken and ready to be synthesized, he eagerly began the process. Although he could not choose the quality of the new item, Rolf decided to take a chance. After a few seconds, the synthesis was completed and a new iron sword was in his hands. The system reported that the sword's attack power had increased by 10 units, and its value had increased to 5,000 guard. Rolf slowly raised the sword, feeling its increased strength. The metallic luster of the blade reflected the sunlight that played on its surface, as if celebrating the importance of this moment. He swung the sword, and every muscle in his body felt the increased power of the blow. It was as if an increase in his own strength was seamlessly transferring to the weapon he held in his hands. Bernard, who was standing nearby, watched Rolf with disbelief and surprise. He couldn't believe his eyes. The sword created by fusion had become much stronger without the blacksmith's involvement. This opened up new possibilities and perspectives for them. Bernard, still stunned by what he had seen, asked Rolf if it was possible to make the sword even stronger. Rolf, realizing the importance of the possibilities before them, explained that there was a certain probability of success with each amplification. However, if an attempt to strengthen it twice failed, the object might break. This information caused Bernard to respect Rolf's new skill even more. He looked thoughtfully at the sword and, weighing the risks, admitted that he had never seen an item with a +1 reinforcement. Even to him, with his vast experience, it was obvious that the sword had become much more powerful. Bernard continued to ponder aloud, saying that such a weapon was best not to be offered for sale in ordinary shops. Bernard, with a serious expression on his face, explained that items enhanced with magic fusion might arouse suspicion. Rolf nodded in understanding, realizing that their new abilities and artifacts needed to be kept secret so as not to attract unnecessary attention. At this moment, Elsa looked at Bernard and noticed that he had a very interesting eye. It was of an unusual, deep red color, and seemed to be hiding some kind of secret. Bernard, catching her eye, smiled and, pointing to the eye, jokingly asking if she was talking about this eye, began to explain its properties. Bernard, feeling Elsa's gaze on him, explained that his unusual eye possessed the rare skill of discernment. With it, he could determine the true value of objects, distinguishing between fakes and treasures, as well as predict the trajectory of enemies' attacks, which made it invaluable in battle. Rolf was amazed to hear this, for it explained the nickname Red-Eyed, which had taken hold of Bernard among their comrades. Bernard, noticing Rolf's astonishment, remarked that the latter was also developing increasingly surprising abilities. Rolf agreed, but noted with some sadness that his skills were not always useful in battle, although they were impressive. He hoped that Elsa would always be there for him, as her support was invaluable to him. With a smile on his face, he looked at her, expressing his gratitude. Vanessa, with her wit and candor, remarked that it seemed to be fate. Vanessa looked at Rolf carefully, her eyes sparkling with challenge. She suggested that he think about what would happen if Elsa left, pointing out that he would then become completely useless. Rolf was dumbfounded at the thought. He felt her words hurt his ego and confidence. At this moment, Elsa could not contain her emotions. Her voice shook with indignation as she declared that she would never leave Rolf. Vanessa, seeing their reaction, smiled and added with a warm smile that she understood that and that they would always be together. However, her look suddenly became serious, and turning to Rolf again, Vanessa reminded him that groups like theirs rarely last long. She warned that someday they might fall apart. Rolf realized that she was right. Life is full of unpredictable twists and turns, and even the strongest alliances can fall apart. The thought seared into his soul, making him think about the future. Despite the seriousness of the moment, Vanessa soon turned their attention to pressing matters. She suggested that they prepare for the next stage of training. The next moment, as if by magic, a whole group of formidable golems appeared behind her, their massive stone bodies towering, creating an intimidating sight. Vanessa ordered everyone to be ready for training. Rolf and Elsa were astonished by the number of golems. The unexpected appearance of so many opponents forced them to move quickly, dodging their attacks. The golems chased after them, destroying everything in their path, and it wasn't just a training session, but a real test of endurance and coordination. They had to work together to survive in this chaos. After a while, when the dust settled and the training came to an end, they returned to their camp again, tired but determined. Now they were once again busy synthesizing items, seeking to improve their weapons and armor. Rolf, using his new abilities, improved his swords, feeling their power increase each time. Elsa assisted him by destroying old swords and preparing them for synthesis, her magic intertwined with his skills, creating an amazing process of transformation. When they were finished, Bernard went over to inspect the result of their work. He marveled at the quality of the new swords. Their luster and energetic aura spoke of the great power contained within them. Bernard remarked that he had never seen so many legendary items in one place. Rolf, proud of what he had accomplished, explained that he had enhanced all the items with fusion regeneration. He also mentioned that some of the items had broken in the process, but that was an unavoidable risk. 9 days of continuous labor and training paid off as Rolf absorbed all the crystals and his regeneration level reached level 25. With each new level, his passive skills improved, and the system awarded him stars indicating the rarity and power of his abilities. The more stars, the higher the skill's effectiveness was. It was an incredible achievement, taking him to a new level of power and capability. Bernard, holding the sword in his hands, was astonished to realize that he had a legendary weapon in front of him. His thoughts turned to the blacksmiths who spent decades creating such masterpieces, and Rolf was able to create it in a matter of moments. He realized that if he put such swords for sale in large quantities, the market might become oversaturated and the price would drop. Vanessa, catching his train of thought, explained what Bernard meant. Too many goods on the market would lower their value. Bernard, thinking it over, suggested selling the swords to gun shops, where demand is always high and there would be no problem with sales. Realizing that an unknown dungeon full of traps and dangerous monsters awaited them, Bernard ordered everyone to take equipment. He reminded them that they knew little about the upcoming ordeal, so they should be prepared for anything. After a while, the whole team was fully equipped and ready for the upcoming adventure. Rolf, adjusting his armor, approached Elsa and asked if she was ready. Elsa, already dressed in her battle robes, looked collected and determined. Her eyes sparkled with determination, and despite the slightly open breastplate, she seemed invulnerable. Rolf asked with a slight concern in his voice if her breastplate was too open, but Elsa only looked at him in surprise, not understanding his concern. At that moment, Vanessa approached them. She smiled and declared that they looked terrific, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead of them. Bernard, checking his weapons, looked round at everyone and asked if they were ready. Rolf, feeling a surge of confidence from their cohesion, nodded confidently. This gesture confirmed the determination of the entire team. Gathering together, they headed towards the entrance of the dungeon. Each step echoed in the silence of the forest, and despite their confidence, they could not shake off the slight excitement. Before going downstairs, they exchanged final advice, urging each other to be extremely cautious. Watching their determined faces, one could feel the unity and faith in success overwhelming each of them. However, none of them suspected that at this time they were being closely watched from behind the dense trees. Dark figures hidden in the shadows were watching their every move. Daggers glittered in the hands of these mysterious watchers, ready to leap out of their hiding places and strike at any moment. Elsa cautiously descended the hanging staircase inside the dungeon. Each step creaked under her weight, and the light from Bernard's torch at the bottom flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The air grew increasingly cold and damp as she descended deeper and deeper. Rolf, who remained upstairs, watched her descent restlessly and asked if she was all right. Elsa turned round and looked up and shouted that she was fine, her voice echoing off the stone walls. Finally, Elsa reached the ground, her feet touching the cold, hard floor of the dungeon. Standing at the bottom, she looked up at Rolf and, worried for his safety, asked him to be careful. Rolf was the last to descend, his movements confident but cautious. Bernard, holding a torch to illuminate the dark corners, suggested they begin their exploration, and the group began their journey through the dark labyrinths of the dungeon. They moved forward, looking around and listening for every rustle. The shadows created by the flickering torchlight danced on the walls, turning ancient symbols and runes into living creatures. The smell of dampness and ancient stone lingered in the air, giving the place an air of mystery and danger. Rolf led them through the winding corridors of the dungeon, lit only by the flickering torches. Each step was echoed with a muffled sound that reinforced the sense of antiquity and mystery of the place. After a while they reached a spacious room, in the center of which once stood a crystal ball. Rolf, stopping at the pedestal, pointed to the empty space and explained that this was where the orb used to be. His voice sounded quiet but confident, filling the space around him. He explained that further down the corridor there should be another room, which Elsa had discovered thanks to her destruction skill. The next target awaited them, but the path to it was unexpectedly difficult. As they began to approach the intended location, their footsteps suddenly fell silent, swallowed up by the sound of splashing water. A flooded passage spread out before them. The water, dark and opaque, obstructed their path. It seemed bottomless and frightening, its surface reflecting the flickering light of the torches, creating the illusion of an abyss. Bernard, after carefully examining the flooded passage in front of them, took a deep breath and declared that they would have to overcome the flooded part of the dungeon in order to continue their journey. His voice sounded confident and determined despite the seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Bernard walked over to a massive stone pillar that towered nearby and tied a sturdy rope tightly around it. He then turned to his team and explained that they needed to tie the rope around each other. It was a precaution in case any of them got lost or got into trouble in this flooded part of the dungeon. The rope would be their guiding thread that would allow them to return to their starting point even if darkness and water separated them. Bernard looked at Vanessa carefully and squinted at her and asked her to use the underwater breathing spell. Vanessa nodded without hesitation and raised her graceful staff and closed her eyes to concentrate on the spell. She began to quietly and measuredly recite the magic words, and soon the staff glowed with a soft but dazzling light. In the same instant, the entire squad felt their bodies being enveloped by a magical energy that gave them unusual abilities. The sensation was strange, almost magical, as if they had become part of another reality. As the light dissipated, Vanessa opened her eyes and smiled. She explained that each of them was now able to breathe underwater. Wasting no time, the group plunged into the cool waters of the underground lake. Elsa was amazed. She could breathe underwater as if it was completely natural. She savored this new feeling, marveling at Vanessa's magical power. The group moved forward through the narrow passage, the water gently hugging their bodies, giving them a sense of security. The passage seemed endless, but they did not stop. Bernard, always alert, spotted a small gap in the stone wall. He signaled to the others and they cautiously swam to the spot. Emerging from the water, the travelers found themselves in front of a huge ancient door. Bernard looked round it carefully and noticed that there was no visible lock on the door. He immediately suspected a trap and urged everyone to be careful. Rolf, who had always listened to Bernard's intuition, turned to Elsa and quietly told her that his father had always warned him about such things. Dungeons often have traps on the doors to prevent unwanted guests from entering. Vanessa cast a worried glance at Rolf and asked him to remember to check the rope that served as their only way back. Rolf, nodding in agreement, headed for the rope. However, as he was about to tie it to a sturdy rock, something unusual caught his attention. The rope they had trusted so much was floating in the water of the lake, as if it had been forgotten or left behind by accident. Elsa, noticing his confusion, asked what had happened. Rolf, pulling the rope out of the lake, could not believe his eyes. It had been severed. The travelers discovered that the rope they had left behind to go back had been severed. Panic and bewilderment took possession of them. Rolf, seeing this, was particularly upset, for he had personally secured the rope and was sure it would stand up to any challenge. He tried in vain to understand how this could have happened. At that moment, Vanessa approached him. She quietly but confidently suggested that he take a closer look at the scrap of rope. Crouching down beside Rolf, she pointed out the clear cut marks. The rope had not broken, it had been cut. This news caused a new wave of alarm among the friends. No one realized who could have done it and for what purpose. However, Vanessa, who was always attentive to detail and knew many dungeon mysteries, had a hunch. She explained that if the rope had been cut, it meant that there were other adventurers in the dungeon. Perhaps these strangers were trying to confuse them or hinder their progress. Bernard, always collected and ready for any eventuality, surmised that someone had purposely cut the ropes so that they would get lost in the labyrinth. Despite the situation, Bernard realized that there was no point in going back now. He suggested that they go on, for they had not yet found any other passages, and so could not lose their way. After checking the massive door for traps and finding nothing suspicious, Bernard warned everyone about the possible monsters that might be lurking behind it. Everyone braced themselves for possible danger and stood with their weapons at the ready. Bernard, carefully placing his hand on the massive door, began to slowly and carefully open it. The creak of the heavy hinges echoed through the dark corridors of the dungeon, heightening the tension among the travelers. When the door finally swung open, they were confronted by a huge stone statue that stood right in the center of the spacious room. The statue was majestic and inspired a sense of ancient power. It depicted an unknown deity or warrior, with intricate details carved with remarkable precision. Reese, Elsa's little wolf cub, instantly rushed towards the statue and began to growl furiously at it as if it were a living creature that posed a threat. Elsa, surprised and alarmed by her pet's behavior, could not understand what had caused him to react in such a way. She pressed Reese against her, trying to calm him down, but the wolf cub continued to growl, not taking his eyes off the stone statue. Bernard, taking a closer look at the statue and looking around, suggested that there might be a trap set nearby that, when activated, would make the statue come to life and attack them. His words made everyone even more cautious. Vanessa, always perceptive and attentive to detail, moved closer and began to study the ancient runes carved at the base of the statue. She noticed a faint flicker of magical energy and surmised that the statue could indeed come to life when a certain spell was activated. She turned to Elsa, who was still holding the restless Reese, and asked if the wolf cub was annoyed by the statue. Elsa, trying to reassure her pet, replied that Reese really didn't seem to like the stone giant. Vanessa nodded, thinking about possible reasons for the wolf cub's reaction. The next moment, Reese suddenly jumped out of Elsa's arms and rushed forward. He rushed straight towards the room's exit, as if something was driving him. Elsa, without hesitation, rushed after her pet. Rolf tried to stop her, but when he realized it was useless, he ran after her. In a moment, all the others, leaving their preparations behind, rushed after Elsa. Elsa raced ahead, keeping her eyes on the wolf cub, while the others hurried after her, trying to figure out what was going on. Reese stopped suddenly at one of the exits leading into the darkness. Rolf stepped closer, looking around warily, and asked what was wrong. The wolf cub stood looking in the direction where the other passageway was, and something told Elsa that Reese wanted to go that way. Everyone noticed that a body of muddy water stretched further away. Bernard, analyzing the situation, said that thanks to the magic of underwater breathing, they would be able to pass this way without any problems. However, the turbidity of the water made him uneasy. Vanessa, wasting no time, suggested using another magic. She raised her staff and cast a spell, casting a spell on everyone that allowed them to walk on water. Now, as if by magic, the group could move on the surface of the water. They stepped cautiously onto the water surface, feeling unusual, and headed forwards along a dark corridor. A light could be seen at the end of the corridor, and this gave them hope. When the travelers emerged from the dark corridor, a picture appeared before their eyes that none of them could believe. They found themselves right on the shore of Lake Wang. The majestic water surface stretched out before them, sparkling in the sun like a huge sapphire. Reese the wolf cub, instantly feeling free, happily ran towards the water, his little paws leaving footprints on the soft sand of the shore. Bernard, looking around, was shocked. Lake Van, a sacred and legendary place, was here, right in front of them. This meant that the city of Agdorvan, of which they had heard so much, must be somewhere nearby. None of them could believe such good fortune. They stood stunned, unable to contain their astonishment. Suddenly Vanessa, always attentive to detail, said that it might not be a way out of the dungeon, but an entrance. Her words made everyone wary. Soon they noticed an old tombstone not far away, covered with moss and thyme. Vanessa moved closer, gingerly touching the ancient stones, and saw that the inscription on the tombstone was in a divine language. She surmised that this tombstone might be related to Mr. Dwyrus. Elsa, intrigued, asked if Dwyrus was the same god who had created the world. Rolf confirmed her guess, adding that, in addition to Dwyrus, there is another god, the Great Beast. It is Dwyrus who blesses people and grants them skills, allowing them to survive and thrive. Vanessa looked at Bernard and asked him to read the inscription on the tombstone, hoping that his knowledge would help solve the mystery. Bernard, though he admitted he was not good at the divine language, nevertheless came closer and tried to make sense of the ancient symbols. He could only read part of the inscription, which spoke of some friend who had created the world with someone else. The rest of the text was too damaged to be understood. Based on the text he read, Rolf surmised that it was probably the grave of a friend who had helped God. Bernard, after giving the inscription a close look, shook his head skeptically. He stated that it seemed unlikely to him that God would have a friend in the ordinary sense of the word. He suggested that the memorial might be dedicated to both gods, but then the meaning of the word friend remained unclear. Suddenly Elsa turned to the others, squinting thoughtfully, and asked if they remembered the room with the statue. There was a note of surprise in her voice. She recalled that there was a statue there that she thought represented Dwyrus. This thought led her to speculate that perhaps that was where Dwyrus was buried. Rolf, upon reflection, agreed with her that it was quite possible. Their thoughts drifted in the direction that the two gods might have been together, but it was so long ago that their traces were lost in the dust of time. The musings were interrupted by Risi, who suddenly ran up to them and barked, attracting their attention. The wolf cub looked at them anxiously, and Elsa wondered what could possibly connect Risi and the statue of the girl they had seen. Bernard, frowning slightly, admitted that he didn't know the answer, but noted that it was good that they had learnt about the trap and the secret entrance. Perhaps it really was a secret burial ground. The travelers agreed that their find was a stroke of luck, and now that Risi had calmed down, they could continue exploring. They moved cautiously through the dark corridors, each step accompanied by the echo of their footsteps. Bernard, attentive to detail, made notes of everything they found along the way. The corridors seemed endless, and each hid new mysteries. They explored every niche, every turn, so as not to miss anything important. After several hours of grueling search, they began to take turns getting out of the dungeon, and Rolf was the last to leave. Bernard, studying his notes, was relieved that they had been lucky there were no monsters and the map of the dungeon was almost complete. They now knew exactly the path from the hole in the forest to the entrance by Lake Van. Bernard, while making entries in his diary, remembered the strange statue in the small room of the dungeon. He noted that he must remember to mention it in his report, as it could have been important to their research. After finishing his notes, he suggested that the group finish for the day and continue tomorrow. Everyone agreed, deciding that they needed to build up their energy for new discoveries. As they began to wind down, suddenly someone called out to Rolf. They turned round and saw a group consisting of Figaro, Gatto, Arya and several other escorts. No one expected to encounter the Golden Lion Guild, which was famous for its insolence and arrogance here. Bernard, frowning, stepped forward and asked what had brought them here. Figaro, with a dismissive smile, said that they had come to explore the dungeon. These words startled Rolf. Figaro, savoring the effect, added that they had decided to do the job themselves, as they felt that Bernard's group was incapable of doing anything. In his tone he made it clear that their presence here was unwelcome, and they should leave. Figaro then loudly ordered his escorts to advance, ignoring any possible danger. Bernard, without losing his composure, shouted to Figaro, warning him of the many narrow passages and flooded areas inside the dungeon where one could easily get lost. But Figaro arrogantly replied that they did not need anyone's help and that they would manage on their own. The convoys, hearing Bernard's warning, stopped in confusion. They did not understand why their leader would refuse to help, knowing how dangerous the dungeon could be. Figaro, however, expressing his pride, declared that they were the proud Golden Lions and did not need help from such a weak group. His words caused quiet whispering among the escorts, some of whom began to question Figaro's judgment. Suddenly, one of the escorts quietly whispered to his comrade that it was Figaro who had cut Bernard's rope, but that despite this, the group had managed to return. His comrade, terrified of the consequences, sharply besought him, warning him not to say it loudly. At this point, Bernard's entire group heard the convoys whispering and were startled. Rolf, seething with anger, turned to Figaro, his eyes glittering with indignation. He asked Figaro if it was true, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. Figaro, as if not noticing his condition, merely smiled, feigning surprise, and with feigned innocence asked what they were talking about, claiming that he would never do such a thing. Rolf, barely restrained from lashing out at Figaro, was ready to explode with anger. However, Bernard, who always maintained his composure and sensible approach to situations, intervened. He remarked that perhaps it was someone else, for there are so many foolish adventurers in the world capable of such shenanigans. Figaro, hearing Bernard's words, again feigned understanding and smiled kindly, although a spark of slyness flashed in his eyes. The next moment Figaro, with an arrogant look, ordered his troop to prepare to explore the dungeon and move forward. His confidence and disregard for danger made Bernard uneasy, but he realized that he had no power to change Figaro's mind. Vanessa, noticing Aria who was wearing a cap, couldn't resist smiling and loudly remarked that Aria still hadn't completed her assignment. Aria, remaining silent, pulled the cap even deeper on her head and began to descend into the dungeon, disregarding Vanessa's remark. Vanessa sighed, expressing her disappointment at the stubbornness of the Golden Lion group. Despite that, Bernard suggested forgetting about what had happened. He suggested that they focus on dinner, claiming that there were no monsters inside the dungeon and thus no danger. His suggestion was met with approval, and everyone headed to the carriage to rest and eat dinner. In the late afternoon, Elsa enjoyed a relaxing bath, soaking in warm water that relieved fatigue and tension. Suddenly her peace was disturbed by a strange sound. She became alert and turned around to see what was going on. To her horror, she saw someone's palm touching the window. Elsa screamed, her heart beating faster with fear. Everyone else sitting in the living room instantly rose to their feet upon hearing her scream. Elsa, wrapped in a towel, ran out to them, her face contorted with fear. No one realized what had happened, but everyone immediately rushed after her, following her towards the bathroom. Elsa led them to the window and, in a trembling voice, declared that there was a man outside. They all saw the marks of a hand that had touched the glass, and this caused them to be alarmed. Rolf and Bernard immediately jumped outside, looking around for the stranger. Rolf spotted a shadow in the distance, and shouted to Bernard that the man was there. They rushed towards him, their hearts pounding with adrenaline. As they ran closer, they saw the wounded man sitting on the ground, bleeding. Rolf, examining the wounded man, recognized him as one of the Golden Lions. The man's face was pale and blood had soaked his clothes, leaving scarlet stains on the ground. Rolf asked why he was alone. Where were the rest of their group? The man, struggling to raise his head, asked for their help in a weak voice, his eyes full of despair and pain. Pointing with a trembling hand in the direction of the dungeon, he began to tell what had happened. He said that their group had descended into the dungeon, hoping for a quick and successful expedition. But barely had they gone deeper into the dark corridors when a huge monster appeared out of nowhere. The group of Golden Lions descended into the dungeon with enthusiasm and self-confidence, unaware of what lay ahead. The very statue that Bernard and his companions had seen earlier suddenly came to life. The stone eyes of the monster shone with an evil light, and the massive body came to life, filled with ancient magical energy. None of the Golden Lions knew of the existence of such a monster, nor did they have any idea of its power. The statue began to move, and the Golden Lions, gripped by panic, rushed out. The stone monster chased after them, inexorably approaching. The stone serpents that immediately began spewing flames. The fiery tongues swept through the narrow corridors, burning everything in their path. Figaro was stunned by the chaos taking place. Aria, leaning over to Gato, whispered that it was time to leave, and they began to run away, unwilling to risk their lives for a mad expedition. Figaro, seeing them fleeing, shouted, not realizing where they were going. Aria, looking back at him over her shoulder, shouted that it was his own fault for this nightmare. Gato, continuing to run away, thanked him for the good payments, but said he wasn't going to risk his life for him. Aria added that they were breaking the contract and Figaro, seized with anger, threatened them with revenge. Godot, with a mocking smile, wished him luck, realizing that Figaro's chances of success were slim. The monster, rumbling and angry, ran up to Gato. Its huge paw slammed down on the wall with force, causing the stones to collapse. The stone avalanche thundered down on Gato, knocking him down and causing him to fall. Aria, who was running ahead, suddenly stopped and looked back, hearing Gato's screams. Panic flashed in her eyes, but she quickly pulled herself together and used magic to create a wall of ice, hoping to protect her mate from the monster's fury. However, the ice barrier was unable to keep the monster at bay. The creature burst through it with fury, and in the next instant struck Aria with such force that she collapsed to the ground. Her body lay motionless, and it seemed that she was no longer breathing. At this time the monster turned his attention to Figaro and pinned him to the ground with his powerful paw with anger. Figaro, seized with terror, felt the life drain from his body. At that moment, like a ghost, Rolf ran up to Figaro. With incredible strength and determination, he plunged his sword into the monster's paw. The monster let out a roar and retreated, allowing Figaro to breathe freely. Figaro was amazed that Rolf had come to his aid, despite all their previous disagreements. Bernard and the rest of his group rushed to his aid. Bernard, with anxiety in his eyes, reported that one of Figaro's men had told them everything that had happened in the dungeon. Vanessa, with cold determination, stated that they were willing to rescue Figaro, but a significant reward would be required. Their words were full of determination, for they realized that in this situation any step could prove decisive. Rolf, assessing the situation, ordered Figaro to hide in a safe place so as not to interfere with the battle. The monster was closing in on them again, the stone serpents spewing fire and poisonous mist, filling the dungeon with suffocating gas. Rolf quickly realized that it was necessary to protect themselves from the poisonous mist and suggested that they use magic to create a water cover. Vanessa agreed and concentrated, summoning a shimmering water shell around the group that was supposed to protect them from the noxious fumes. Bernard, realizing the seriousness of the situation, shouted that he would distract the monster and Vanessa and Elsa should attack it while Rolf would take care of protecting the group. He rushed forward and the monster followed him. Everyone agreed to the plan and went into action. Rolf, watching Bernard, was amazed at his skill. Bernard moved with incredible speed and agility, dodging the monster's attacks. He delivered quick and accurate blows, but even he realized that he could barely dodge the monster's powerful attacks. Bernard, assessing the situation, realized that the monster was clearly not using its full power. Its attacks were accurate but not lethal, as if the monster was playing with them, enjoying their fear and weakness. This was more than just a battle, it was a cruel game in which the monster taunted its victims. The travelers realized that what stood before them was not just a monster, but a reanimated statue filled with ancient magical energy. This creature was the embodiment of the evil that had lived within these walls for centuries, waiting for its time. Bernard, feeling his strength leaving him, continued to maneuver, dodging the blows. Suddenly he heard himself being called. Vanessa, seeing his condition, realized that she had to act quickly. Concentrating all her magic power, she summoned a powerful ice wall that appeared between the monster and Bernard. The monster, not expecting such a turn, crashed into the ice barrier with fury. The ice cracked under the impact, but the monster was temporarily stopped. Elsa and Vanessa looked at each other, realizing that they had to act quickly and decisively. Bernard, seeing their doubts, said that it was a great idea. But the next moment, the monster roared with renewed vigor. It turned out that it had been able to destroy the ice barrier with its fiery breath and was now completely free. Bernard, seeing the growing threat, shouted that he would be the bait and ordered Rolf to keep the monster away from the others. Rolf, clutching his sword, replied confidently that Bernard could rely on him. With these words, Bernard ran, and Rolf remained standing with his sword at the ready right in front of the monster. He saw its enormous size and did not understand what kind of creature it was, but he knew that now was not the time for fear. He was an adventurer, and in his hands was his father's sword, a legendary weapon that had been passed down in their family for generations. Rolf prepared for battle. When the monster brought its paw down on him, he had time to put up his shield. The force of the blow was overwhelming, and Rolf realized that if he hadn't had that legendary shield in his hands, he might not have survived. The next moment, the monster started spewing fire directly at Rolf. He felt the heat, cowered and fell, but managed to get up despite the scalding flames. Bernard, wasting no time, seized the moment and with the precision of a swordsman cut off the head of one of the snakes that accompanied the monster. He shouted that now the monster would not be able to use its venom, which gave them some advantage. But that didn't stop the monster. The next moment it soared above them, its huge wings cutting the air. The monster opened its maw, and something sinister glowed in its depths. Bernard, not realizing what the light was, shouted to Rolf to retreat, foreboding that something terrible was coming. Rolf, full of determination and rage, shouted that he would not retreat, for if he did, Vanessa and Elsa would be in danger. His voice echoed throughout the dungeon, causing everyone around him to feel a sense of impending battle. Bernard, seeing Rolf's steadfastness, realized that the monster was preparing for the next attack. At that moment, Elsa, frightened and excited, shouted to Rolf, warning him of the danger. But it was too late. The monster, emitting an ominous roar, began spewing huge flames aimed directly at Rolf. The fire flew with such speed and power that it seemed to consume everything in its path. Without losing his composure, Rolf put up his shield, hoping that it could protect him from the fire's fury. The shield, enchanted with ancient magic, began to absorb the flames, but its capabilities were limited. The flames were too much, and the shield began to smoke and Rolf's hands were burned with heat. The pain was unbearable, but he gritted his teeth and continued to hold the shield, protecting his friends. Elsa, seeing that Rolf could not hold out for long, shouted that she would not let the monster win. She quickly drew the bowstring of her bow, aiming her arrows at the monster. In the next second, 2 arrows whistled through the air and stabbed straight into the monster's eyes. The monster let out a piercing roar, its huge body twitching in pain. Elsa, putting all her strength into the shot, bounced backwards, falling to the ground. The monster, blinded and enraged, began to thrash about, its fiery breath burning everything in its path. The dungeon was filled with thick smoke mixed with a poisonous mist. Rolf, fighting the pain, ran up to Elsa, checking to see if she was all right. Her face was pale and her hands were trembling from exertion, but she nodded silently, showing that she was ready to continue fighting. Bernard, looking at the monster, quickly assessed the situation and ordered everyone to attack its wings. Vanessa, supporting his plan, shouted to Elsa that she had done well, encouraging her. In the next second, Vanessa used the Wind Blade spell, and a multitude of magic blades, glittering in the dim light of the dungeon, swept straight towards the monster. They stabbed into its wings, leaving tearing holes. The monster, having lost the ability to fly, began to fall. Already approaching the ground, the monster opened its huge maw, preparing for another attack. Rolf, watching him, realized that the monster was probably about to spew another flame, but he knew that retreat was not an option. Elsa, who was standing nearby, ordered him in desperation to run. Rolf, with determination in his eyes, shouted that there was no way he would do that. Elsa was amazed at his courage, and the next second Rolf, wasting no time, ran straight at the monster. Rolf ran with incredible speed and determination, thrusting his sword forward like a spear aimed straight into the monster's mouth. His feet hardly touched the ground, the air itself seemed to drive him towards his goal. The next moment, with precision and force, Rolf's sword pierced through the monster's mouth, digging deeply into its body. The sharp blade traveled through flesh and bone, leaving the monster no chance. The monster let out one last shrill roar that echoed throughout the dungeon and collapsed to the ground. Its huge body collapsed with a rumbling crash, raising a cloud of dust and small stones. Rolf, standing next to his defeated enemy, breathed heavily, realizing that he had done the impossible. He could feel the adrenaline leaving his body, leaving him exhausted and tired. Turning around, he wanted to check if everything had worked out as they had planned, but he didn't have time. Elsa, with joy and relief in her eyes, rushed to him, hugging him forcefully and shouting that he was just doing a great job and a real hero. Everyone else, including Bernard, Vanessa and the group of Golden Lions, stood in amazement. They couldn't believe their eyes as they watched Rolf, who was able to defeat such a powerful monster. Reese barked without ceasing, as if he could still sense the danger. Suddenly, their triumph was interrupted. The monster's body began to move, and its eyes opened again. The monster, as if reborn from the ashes, stood before them as if nothing had happened. Its determination and fury were unbroken, and it once again headed straight for them. Rolf, realizing that the monster was still alive, felt cold sweat running down his back. He was once again facing an enemy that seemed impossible to kill. The monster made ominous sounds, its wounds began to heal, and the fire in its eyes burned with renewed vigor. Realizing that their fight was not over, Rolf raised his sword and prepared for another attack. The monster began to roar with renewed vigor, its deafening roar filling the dungeon with an ominous echo, causing the walls to shake and shatter with small pebbles. Elsa and Rolf looked at it with bewilderment and horror, realizing that the monster was not going to give up despite their best efforts. Vanessa, clutching her staff until her knuckles turned white, grimly observed that the monster was incredibly persistent, its strength and tenacity seeming almost supernatural. Bernard, realizing the gravity of the situation and seeing that their attacks were failing, immediately ordered everyone to retreat, hoping that regrouping would give them a chance of survival and a chance to find a new plan of action. Vanessa, with fury in her gaze, shouted that such persistent monsters were the ones she hated the most. With a wave of her staff, she summoned a pressure zone spell, channeling her magical energy into the air. A huge magical shield appeared above the monster, pinning it to the ground with force, like the invisible hand of a giant. Bernard, seeing the success of the spell, praised Vanessa, noting that the monster would now be unable to move. However, their joy was short-lived. The monster, letting out a furious roar like an outraged god, managed to repel Vanessa's attack and break the magic barrier, scattering shards of magical energy all over the dungeon. The monster rushed back to attack again, its malicious eyes glowing with rage and hatred. Vanessa, without losing her composure, urged everyone to be careful, her voice echoing in the tense silence. With a wave of her staff, she created another shield, which the monster struck with its massive head with all its might, causing a resonant impact that scattered through the air. Rolf, seeing that the situation was becoming critical and that their time was running out, ran up to Elsa and asked if she was all right, his voice trembling with excitement. Elsa nodded and tried to look confident, but her eyes betrayed fear and anxiety. At that moment, Rolf's gaze fell on the bloody stain on the ground, and his heart clenched with horror. It was Bernard bleeding, his wounds looked serious and threatening. Vanessa, holding him, asked with concern in her voice why he had climbed under the blow to protect her, her eyes glistening with tears. Bernard, struggling to breathe, looked at Rolf, his gaze full of pain and determination. In a half-voice, he whispered that Rolf must now become the leader of their group, taking on this heavy responsibility. He ordered him to get everyone out of the dungeon immediately, realizing that their chances of survival were rapidly diminishing. Staring at the approaching monster, Bernard declared that they would not be able to deal with this threat in their current state. Already almost in a whisper, he added that if they stayed, they would all perish together, and continued to cough, his body shaking with pain. Rolf, with despair in his eyes, looked at Vanessa and reminded her that she possessed healing magic, hoping that she could save Bernard. Bernard shouted for Rolf to stay out of the way, realizing that their situation was critical. Vanessa, looking at Bernard pleadingly, stated that she would need a little time to perform the healing spell. Bernard screamed again, demanding that she stop, but Vanessa, reassuring him, asked him to trust her. She pointed to Rolf and noticed that he was determined, his face focused and confident despite the fear and pain. Bernard, after thinking for a moment, then acknowledged that he saw in Rolf a true adventurer capable of leading them to victory and survival. The monster continued to roar, making deafening sounds that echoed throughout the dungeon. Rolf stood right in front of it without retreating a single step. His face was focused and full of determination. The monster's eyes were blazing with rage, and it looked like it was about to lash out at him with renewed vigor. Suddenly, Rolf, realizing that the moment had arrived, loudly ordered Elsa to advance. His voice sounded confident and determined, giving her strength. Without wasting a second, Elsa drew the bowstring of her bow. Her movements were fast and precise. Her face expressed complete concentration, and determination glittered in her eyes. Rolf gritted his teeth and rushed forwards at the monster, his sword gleaming in the dim light of the dungeon. With incredible speed and force, he delivered a crushing blow, severing one of the monster's paws. Thick black blood began to ooze from the severed limb, flooding the stone slabs beneath his feet. The next second, however, the paw began to regenerate, and Rolf was amazed at the sight. He could not believe his eyes as he saw the wound heal and the limb return to its place. Elsa, standing nearby, was concentrating her aim on the monster, trying to pick out the most vulnerable spot. Her bow was stretched to the limit, and the muscles in her arms tensed with the effort. She could feel the tension of the bowstring being transmitted through her body as she prepared to release the deadly projectile. The monster noticed her actions and began to move, but Rolf kept his attention on the monster without moving, allowing Elsa to take aim in peace. Releasing the arrow, Elsa watched it cut through the air with a whistling sound, rapidly approaching her target. Her shot was accurate. The arrow sank straight into the monster's head, causing it to roar furiously. The monster, gripped by pain, began thrashing about, its movements becoming increasingly erratic. In a fit of rage, it ran straight at Elsa. Rolf, seeing the impending threat, raised his shield, and the monster crashed into him with a thunderous crash. The impact was so strong that cracks began to appear in the shield. Rolf realized that the shield wouldn't hold up for long, but he stood firm, protecting Elsa. She, seeing that the situation was becoming critical, ordered Rolf to hold on and stepped forward. Rolf didn't realize what she was going to do, his heart clenched with anxiety. Elsa, in a desperate attempt to save the situation, tore off her gloves. Her voice full of determination echoed throughout the dungeon. She shouted that she would destroy the barrier that was protecting the monster with her skill. Rolf stood confused, not understanding what she was going to do, but trust and faith in her strength prevented him from objecting. Elsa, gathering all her magical power, raised her hands, her eyes glowing with fury and determination. She placed her hands directly on the monster, and from her palms emanated a powerful energy, penetrating the monster's body. The monster began to fall apart, its massive body cracking and disintegrating under her influence. Rolf, standing in front of the monster, shouted with joy and relief in his voice that they had succeeded. His face glowed with triumph, and for a moment it seemed that the battle was over. But Elsa, breathing heavily, abruptly interrupted his joy by shouting that it wasn't over. Her voice sounded anxious and determined. She continued to approach the monster, her steps confident despite her exhaustion. Elsa put her hand to the monster's mouth, her fingers glowing with magical energy. Concentrating, she channeled all her power into the point of touch, trying to destroy the monster's internal structure. Rolf, seeing her efforts, shouted again that they had succeeded, hoping that this was the end. He watched as the monster began to fall apart, its massive body cracking and disappearing into thin air as if dissolving into nothingness. The monster's head flew off to the side, rolling on the stone floor of the dungeon. Elsa, exhausted from exertion, tried to catch her breath, her hands trembling from overexertion. But in the next second, joy was replaced by horror. All parts of the monster's body began to fall into place, as if an invisible force was picking it up piece by piece. The monster regenerated at a frightening speed, its body recovering as if their attacks had done it no harm. Elsa's skill didn't work as well as they had hoped. Suddenly, Rolf noticed something unusual in the monster's head. His gaze caught a strange glow emanating from the monster's skull. He realized that it was a stone hidden deep inside the skull, which was the source of its regeneration ability. This discovery gave him new hope and a plan of action. Memories of his father flashed through Rolf's mind, of how brave and undaunted he was. The image of his father standing on the battlefield inspired him and gave him strength. At that moment, Rolf's resolve strengthened and he raised his sword, his eyes blazing with determination and fury. Rolf rushed forward, running up to the monster with incredible speed. His steps were quick and precise. He jumped up, aiming his blade straight at the monster's head, aiming for the spot where the magic stone was hidden. The sword pierced the monster's flesh, penetrating deep inside the skull. Suddenly, a system notification flashed before Rolf's eyes as if it had appeared out of nowhere. The system asked him if he wished to improve his blade. Rolf, still stunned by what was happening, did not understand where the suggestion had come from or why now. However, there was no time to ponder, and he agreed. At the same instant, the process of improving his weapon began. The sword in his hands began to glow brightly, changing its shape and structure. Magical energy surrounded the blade, and Rolf felt the power flowing into his weapon. A few seconds later, a new sword appeared in his hands, improved and glowing with magical energy. Elsa ran up to Rolf, her face glowing with joy and relief. She hugged him tightly, her arms shaking with adrenaline and emotion. Rolf, still confused, didn't understand why she was so happy. He asked what to do with the monster, preparing for further action. Elsa, still smiling, shouted that the monster was gone and Rolf had defeated it. He stood there not believing his ears, his heart beating fast, realizing that the battle was over. At that moment, Bernard ran up to them, his face full of pride and admiration. He praised Rolf for his courage and determination. His words were full of respect. Rolf, not knowing what to say, just nodded. He was overwhelmed with emotion. He felt like a hero, but he still couldn't realize the magnitude of his feat. The convoyers standing in the corner looked at him with bewilderment and amazement. They couldn't believe that Rolf, whom they thought was a mere rubbish man, was able to defeat this terrible monster. Their gazes were full of admiration and respect. Figaro, noticing their confusion, ordered everyone to be silent, his voice stern and determined. Then he shouted that they were going back to the mansion, and his men began to leave, still under the impression of what had happened. Their footsteps echoed around the dungeon. They left Rolf and his group alone with their victory. Vanessa, breathing a sigh of relief, looked around. Her face expressed fatigue and satisfaction. At that moment, everyone turned their attention to Risi, who found something on the ground. Elsa, noticing the wolf cub's strange behavior, squinted in surprise, trying to see what he had found. She stepped closer and saw that it was the same stone that Rolf had destroyed with his sword. The stone flickered with a faint, ominous light, exuding remnants of magical energy. Risi, unaware of the danger, grasped the stone in his sharp teeth. His eyes glowed with curiosity, and his tail wagged merrily from side to side. At that moment Rolf, realizing what was happening, shouted at him with desperation in his voice, urging the wolf cub to stop. His voice echoed throughout the dungeon, filling it with panic and anxiety. Rolf rushed to Risi, grabbing him by the scruff of his neck, and desperately begged him to spit out the stone. He shouted that it couldn't be eaten, for otherwise Risi might turn into a monster. His heart was beating like crazy in his chest and his thoughts were racing, trying to find a way to prevent disaster. He asked the wolf cub to spit out the stone immediately, his voice full of panic and pleading. But Risi, despite Rolf's best efforts, chewed and swallowed the stone. Everyone present froze as if petrified. Shock and horror were reflected on their faces. No one knew what to do next. In the next second, steam escaped from Risi's mouth. His eyes glowed for a moment with a strange, almost supernatural light. Elsa watched breathlessly, her face expressing a mixture of fear and curiosity. Rolf, with trembling hands, let go of the wolf cub and took a step back, keeping his eyes on it. Everyone looked at Risi, not knowing what to expect. But instead of turning into a monster, Risi smiled back at them, his tail continuing to wag as if nothing had happened. He looked completely normal, as if the stone had not affected him in any way. One day, as the sun was setting and soft light was flooding the forest edge, Elsa decided to use her destruction skill. She targeted Vanessa's dress, who was standing nearby. In the blink of an eye, the fabric began to crumble, turning into dust. At the same moment, Rolf, reacting quickly, used his recovery skill. Magical energy surrounded Vanessa, and a few seconds later, she was wearing a new, stunning dress. The fabric shimmered, playing with colors in the light of the setting sun, and Vanessa couldn't help but laugh joyfully. She immediately ran to Bernard to show off her new outfit. However, Bernard, immersed in his own thoughts, was looking at the runes on the sword that had recently appeared on Rolf's sword in the last battle. His eyes glittered with curiosity and admiration. He scrutinized the ancient symbols, running his fingers over the engraved marks. Bernard quietly said that it was a divine language resembling an ancient language, but he couldn't decipher it completely. However, he was able to read the phrase about a ray of light in the pitch darkness and surmised that this sword could greatly enhance its wielder. Rolf pondered, his gaze becoming more focused. Bernard, thoughtfully studying the runes on Rolf's sword, quietly stated that it was definitely a divine language. His gaze was full of admiration and curiosity, as if he had touched the mysteries of ancient times. He suggested that these runes might be related to the goddess, his voice sounding confident and solemn. His gaze then shifted to Elsa, who at this moment was carefully arranging a piece of meat in front of Risi, preparing for dinner. Risi, seeing the piece of meat in front of him, inhaled a full breath and exhaled fire forcefully onto it. His new skill was surprisingly precise in controlling the flames, and the meat instantly browned, turning into a juicy, flavorful steak. The smell of roasting meat spread through the camp, whetting the appetite of everyone present. Everyone was amazed at what had happened, their eyes widening with wonder. Elsa, realizing that her wolf cub now possessed an incredible ability, stated in surprise that it looked like their Risi was becoming a monster. Her voice trembled with a mixture of alarm and admiration. Rolf, watching what was happening, nodded in agreement with her words. However, he noticed that despite this new skill, Risi remained the same sweet wolf cub they knew and loved. Vanessa, with a slight smile on her face, turned to Bernard and remarked that Risi seemed to be fine. Bernard, still immersed in his own thoughts, frowned slightly. He said that might be the case, but one mustn't forget that Risi was a demonic wolf and the possibility of his transformation was high. His voice was full of seriousness, and the words made everyone think. Nevertheless, Bernard noted that their meeting with Risi was most fateful, as if the stars had aligned in the right order for them to find each other. His eyes shone with thoughtfulness as he spoke of how their paths had crossed for a reason. It was as if it was a sign from above that their coming together was destined. Elsa, with heat in her voice, cried out that Risi remained the same, his heart and spirit unchanged. She held the wolf cub tightly to her, feeling his soft fur and the warmth of his body. Rolf supported her, assuring her that it was still their sweet Risi they knew and loved. The wolf cub, sensing the care and love of his friends, began to lick himself, his eyes shining with friendliness and devotion. Bernard, watching this touching scene, smiled. He noticed that indeed, despite all the changes and new abilities, Risi remained the same ordinary wolf cub they knew him to be. His words reassured everyone and a warm and friendly atmosphere reignited in the camp. The next day, when the sun had barely begun to rise above the horizon, Bernard's group traveled to the Adventurers Guild. As soon as they entered the massive building with high wooden ceilings and walls decorated with trophies and banners, all the adventurers gathered in the hall began to look back at them and whisper. Their gazes were full of surprise and respect, and the whispers echoed throughout the hall. Bernard and Ralph were stunned by such attention. Bernard, looking at Ralph, explained that everyone seemed to already know about them and their exploits. The whispers among the adventurers grew louder and louder, and one could pick up scraps of talk that Ralph had defeated a demon that even Figaro and his squad had escaped from. This demon was too strong even for the Golden Lions. Someone suddenly whispered that Gato and Arya had left the guild and were imprisoned. Bernard, hearing this, interjected, wanting to clarify the details. One of the adventurers explained that they were now in a place of perpetual storm, inhabited by powerful monsters, and the living conditions were terrible, with lousy food and constant danger. Ralph, shocked by this news, could not believe his ears. At that moment, the guild master, Mr. Fran, a tall man with wise eyes and a confident gait, approached them. He expressed his joy at seeing them safe and sound. He began the conversation by stating that he had heard Figaro and his squad had gone to investigate the dungeon, although no such request had been officially issued. Fran expressed his surprise and slight displeasure that Figaro had acted on his own without guild approval. Bernard, with an understanding nod, confirmed that Figaro did indeed prefer to act in his own way, not always honoring formalities. Bernard, taking a folder of documents out of his bag, handed Fran the research report. Fran, with visible interest and respect, invited them to go to his office where they could discuss everything in more detail. The guild office was a cozy room, furnished with old oak shelves filled with books and ancient artifacts. On the walls hung maps and drawings depicting various mythical creatures and legendary places. All three of them, Bernard, Ralph and Elsa, sat down at a massive wooden table. Bernard began to tell them that they could not determine the exact name of the place they were exploring, but surmised that the remains of a goddess probably lay there, and that it was something like an ancient crypt. Fran realized that it could be ruins from the time of the ancient wars. His eyes widened in surprise when he realized that no one had been able to discover this place so far despite all attempts. Bernard continued his story, explaining that the entrance to the dungeon was by Lake Van. He described how some of the rooms inside the dungeon are submerged in water, creating an additional difficulty for exploration. Bernard noted that they were only able to discover this dungeon because of Ralph and Elsa, who found another, less obvious entrance. Suddenly Fran's gaze fell on a drawing in the report. It was a picture of a monster with a lion's head, a goat's head, a snake's tail and wings. Fran asked Bernard to wait and, pointing to the drawing, asked him to explain what the creature was. Bernard, with a sigh, explained that this monster had a magical barrier that could repel any attack. He also explained that the monster emitted an all-consuming flame so powerful that they had already despaired of defeating it. Bernard's narrative became increasingly suspenseful. He described how they fought the monster, feeling that all their efforts were in vain. But then he looked at Ralph, his eyes glowing with pride and gratitude. Bernard stated that Ralph was the one who was able to defeat this monster despite all the difficulties. He emphasized that Ralph's courage and determination played a decisive role in this battle. Fran, deeply impressed by Bernard's story, listened attentively to every word, his eyes glowing with admiration and curiosity. When Bernard finished, Fran quietly said that this monster they were talking about was brand new and should definitely be listed in the Monster Encyclopedia. He also added that since the creature had many powers, it could be called a chimera, as is popularly accepted, and that name would probably stick with it. Fran then turned to Ralph and solemnly declared that since he had discovered this monster, its name should be inscribed in the book. Ralph, standing in front of the guild master, was amazed and a little embarrassed that his name would be entered into the Monster Encyclopedia. This was something incredible and exciting to him. Bernard, seeing Ralph's reaction, added that if the adventurers learned about the new monster, many of them would surely want to see it for themselves. He emphasized that they should make sure to spread the information to all the guilds to prepare the adventurers for possible encounters with chimeras. Bernard also noted that by putting Ralph's name in the encyclopedia, perhaps they could get his parents' attention. Ralph realized that Bernard was right. His parents, being adventurers, were often in guilds. This thought gave him hope that one day he would be able to meet them again. Ralph's heart grew warm and determined, and his eyes became more focused. He realized that he had many more adventures ahead of him, but this goal of finding his parents had become even more important to him. As they were already leaving the guild, Ralph and Bernard thanked Fran for his support and help. Suddenly Fran stopped them on the threshold and asked Bernard to stay a while. He stated that he had another important assignment for them. But before he could explain what that assignment was, they were called out by a man with a confident and stern posture. It was Almani, a man with a serious and determined face, dressed in simple but neat clothes. He approached Ralph and Bernard, his eyes expressing respect and insistence. With a discreet bow, he asked them to follow him, adding that Mr. Ferzen invited them to join him. Bernard and Ralph glanced at each other, then nodded and followed Almani down the long corridor of the guild. After a while, they entered Mr. Ferzen's spacious office. The room was tastefully furnished, massive bookcases filled with ancient folios, trophies on the walls testifying to heroic deeds, and a large dark wood desk at which Mr. Ferzen himself sat. His presence was respectful, and his gaze betrayed a man of experience. Mr. Ferzen stood up to greet them and gestured for them to sit down. Bernard and Ralph settled down at the table, feeling a slight tension. Ferzen began the conversation with a deep sigh, his face expressing a mixture of weariness and regret. He stated that he was sorry for the trouble he had caused, explaining that his foolish son had caused them a lot of trouble. The words sounded sincere, and Bernard and Ralph, though stunned, did not know what to say to this. Suddenly, the door to the study swung open with a loud crack, and Figaro rushed in. His face was twisted with anger and resentment. As he approached his father, he angrily declared that it was he, not Bernard and Ralph, who had fought the Chimera. His words sounded defiant, with notes of contempt and arrogance. He added that Gato and Arya were of no use to him, and that he would find new members of the group more worthy next time. Mr. Ferzen, remaining outwardly calm but with fire in his eyes, stood up from the table. His voice was quiet, but there was a formidable power in it. He asked Figaro what he was talking about, and his words cut through the air like a sharp knife. Figaro, seeing the expression on his father's face, fell silent, his self-confidence instantly evaporating. There was a heavy silence, as if the air had thickened. The next second Mr. Ferzen, without raising his voice, but with genuine determination, declared that he was disowning his son. These words sounded like a thunderclap. Figaro could not believe his ears. His face turned pale and he stood as if struck by lightning, his eyes darting about for support but finding only cold determination in his father's eyes. Mr. Ferzen, standing opposite his son, looked at him thoughtfully, his face expressing deep fatigue and disappointment. He began to say that he could turn a blind eye to many things, and even some of his antics he had also overlooked, but now the situation was out of control. Mr. Ferzen stated that Figaro could no longer run his family and that he was now simply destroying the Ferzen family legacy. Figaro, upon hearing these words, wanted to object, but his father gestured to stop him. Ferzen then slowly approached Ralph, his eyes expressing sincere regret. He once again apologized to Ralph for all the trouble his son had caused. Ferzen acknowledged that Figaro's arrogance was his fault, the result of spending too little time raising his son. Ralph, sensing the sincerity in Ferzen's words, gently replied that there was no need to apologize, for it was thanks to Figaro that he had become what he was today. These words silenced Figaro and made him listen. Ralph, looking straight into Mr. Ferzen's eyes, said with firmness in his voice that it was because he was not accepted into the Golden Lions and was expelled from the guild that he was able to meet Elsa and afterwards Mr. Bernard. He explained that everything that had happened to him had eventually led him to important meetings and events in his life, and for that he was grateful to Figaro. These words, full of sincerity and gratitude, came as a surprise to all present. Figaro, hearing such words, seemed to be shaken to the core. His face contorted with a mixture of emotions, from anger and bitterness to embarrassment and regret. He couldn't stand it, and without a word he ran out of the study, speeding down the corridors of the mansion and out of sight. The silence that followed his departure was deafening. Ferzen, slowly approaching the window, said with a heavy sigh that Figaro was his heir. Looking into the distance, his voice trembled with hidden grief. He confessed that he now saw that his son was not yet ready to inherit his title, for he was too young and immature. In these words sounded all the weight of a father's disappointment and the pain of lost hopes. Bernard and Ralph, standing nearby, watched in silence, not knowing how to comfort the old man. Their presence seemed to bring at least a little support to Ferzen at this difficult moment. Turning to them, he continued that perhaps Almani could take Figaro's place. His voice was full of determination and firmness, as if he had already begun to make new plans for the future. Frizen walked over to the table and pulled out a bag of money from underneath it, which he placed in front of Bernard and Rolf. His face grew serious again as he declared that it was a reward for saving his son. Bernard, taking the pouch in his hands and feeling its weight, asked with a slight smile if Mr. Frizen thought the amount offered was too large. Frizen, smiling gently, explained that the pouch contained money not only for the rescue but also for all the inconvenience caused. He emphasized that he wished to continue to maintain friendly relations with the adventurers and traders, and therefore considered the sum fair. Frizen, sensing the glances of Bernard and Rolf, continued his explanation with determination and deep seriousness. He explained that the sack contained not only money for the rescue of his son, but also compensation for all the inconvenience Rolf had had to endure. His voice was even, but there was a genuine concern for justice in it. Frizen said that because of the unfounded accusations, Rolf had been forced to pay a debt to the guild that was now completely cancelled. He explained that he had returned all the money Rolf had spent to pay the debt, thus restoring justice. In addition, Frizen announced that Rolf's house, which had been confiscated, had now been returned to him. This announcement sent a wave of relief and joy through the room. Pointing to the bag of money, Frizen added with a slight smile that there was also a small allowance there for Rolf's labors. These words were said with respect and appreciation, emphasizing Rolf's contribution to the overall victory over the monster and his role in the rescue. Rolf, realizing all these well-intentioned actions, stood in slight shock. He looked at the bag of money in silence, realizing how much had been done for him. His eyes were full of gratitude, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, he quietly thanked Mr. Frizen, his voice trembling with emotion. In that simple word was all his recognition and appreciation. Elsa ran joyfully into Rolf's house, which was now once more his own. Entering his old dwelling, Rolf noticed that the house had become empty and would need a lot of repairs. Despite this, a warm nostalgia was kindled in his heart. He left Reese outside and asked him to let him know if anyone came near. The loyal wolf cub barked in response, ready to guard the house. Upon entering his room, Rolf felt mixed feelings: joy at his return and slight embarrassment. Elsa followed him and looked round the room with curiosity. Rolf, noticing her interest, confessed that he felt a little embarrassed about the way his house now looked. He began rummaging through the desk, persistently trying to find something. Elsa, unable to resist asking what he was looking for, but Rolf did not stop in his search. Suddenly his hand fumbled for a small box, and he pulled out a chain from which hung 2 rings. Elsa looked at him in surprise, her eyes filled with questions. Rolf, feeling a wave of memories, began to tell Elsa the story of the wedding rings. He explained that the rings belonged to his grandmother, and when his father married his mother, his grandmother gave the rings to the newlyweds. His parents, not wanting to lose these family heirlooms during their many travels, left them at home for safekeeping. Rolf continued, his voice full of tenderness and respect. He said that in the last days of his life, his grandmother had given the rings to him, instructing him to give them to someone he would love with all his heart. Now, standing in front of Elsa, Rolf felt his heart begin to beat faster. He asked if she would accept the ring, and her eyes, full of surprise and excitement, met his. Elsa, trembling slightly with emotion, asked if he was sure of his decision. Rolf stood directly in front of Elsa, his heart beating faster than usual. The words were stuck in his throat, as if afraid to come out. He could feel the tension building and, gathering all his resolve, suddenly declared that she was not just a friend to him, but a special person. Elsa, shocked by his confession, accepted the ring gratefully, her eyes glistening with emotion. As she looked at the ring, she noticed that it held a history and meaning, much more than just a piece of jewelry. Rolf, seeing her reaction, smiled softly, feeling the weight leave his shoulders. Then, however, a shadow of sadness appeared in her eyes, and she quietly asked what she should do with this ring. Elsa reminded him that she could not put it on her finger. Rolf, without losing his temper, gently took the ring back and put it on the chain, then carefully hung the chain around Elsa's neck. She looked at him in surprise, and Rolf explained with a soft smile that this way the ring would be safe and would not break. Elsa, touched by his caring and sincerity, immediately rushed to him and hugged him tightly. They looked at each other, their eyes full of emotion and tenderness. Time seemed to stop. Their faces began to slowly approach each other, and Rolf felt his heart beating faster with each passing moment. He saw in Elsa's eyes a reflection of his own feelings, and that made the moment even more meaningful. But suddenly this magical moment was interrupted by Risi's loud barking. Both of them flinched and, distracted from their thoughts, looked out the window. Standing in the street were Bernard and Vanessa, who, smiling, waved at them. Bernard, with a kind smile, asked if they were ready to go and invited them to join them. Rolf and Elsa looked at each other and, exchanging smiles, confidently declared that they were on their way. This moment, despite the unexpected interruption, left a warm feeling of closeness in their hearts. Already at the carriage, Vanessa asked Rolf with a mischievous smile if he had found what he was looking for. Rolf, pointing to the ring on his finger and the chain and ring around Elsa's neck, nodded. Vanessa, congratulating them, declared that she too would like to wear such a ring, her voice full of merriment and joy for her friends. Bernard, grinning, suggested she just go out and buy it, which caused everyone to smile and laugh. And then, with a serious expression on his face, Bernard announced that they had a new assignment. His voice sounded resolute and confident, attracting the attention of everyone gathered. He explained that they had been assigned to deliver very valuable materials to a famous blacksmith in Minsk. These materials were so important that the success of a significant project depended on their delivery. Vanessa, with her discerning eye, immediately understood the importance of the mission and nodded in agreement. Rolf, feeling responsible for the upcoming task, expressed his understanding and readiness to fulfill it. He knew that now they had a new goal before them that required not only strength but also wit. They all quickly packed up and seated in the carriage, prepared for the long journey. As the wheels of the carriage began to creak and the horses slowly moved off, Rolf looked back once more, bidding farewell to the town of Agdorven, the place where he was born and raised. Rolf had mixed feelings as he looked at the distant streets and houses. There was a slight sadness in his heart at saying goodbye to his hometown, but at the same time he felt excitement and joy at the journey ahead. He saw his new future already in front of him, connected with these people with whom he had gone through so many trials. Each of them became for him not just a comrade in arms, but a true friend. The girl announced with a majestic look and unwavering confidence that in the sixth world, the forces of destruction and rebirth had joined into one. She was no mere messenger, but the goddess Sazakurain herself, who added that the legendary beast surrounded by myths and fears had awakened. All this was taking place in a holy land where every stone and tree held ancient powers. In the center of the great hall, surrounded by radiance and majesty, sat the lady on her throne. Her presence represented power and wisdom. Next to her, representing the first world, stood the goddess Barigal. She bowed her head in thoughtfulness and asked what exactly Sazakurain meant, for could humans have received the powers of destruction and rebirth? Her words were full of doubt and anxiety, for such powers could turn the whole world upside down. On either side of the throne room stood other deities. Goddess Eclipse, who represented the third world, and Goddess Axe Lion, who embodied the second world, were listening attentively. Their gazes expressed a mixture of interest and concern. They exchanged glances and, without restraining their thoughts, asked if this world was ruled by Dwyrus, the great and powerful. The goddess Sazakurain, with a faint chuckle, declared that such power was not fit for mere mortals, hinting at the negligence of the goddess of the sixth world. Goddess Barigal nodded in agreement, her eyes flashing with understanding and realization. She recalled that the seal Lady Sazakurain had placed on the beast had been broken by the blade left behind by Dwyrus in that world. These words, filled with reproach and anxiety, made everyone wonder what was happening in the world. Goddess Sazakurain, with a note of sarcasm in her voice, remarked that the goddess of the sixth world seemed to be completely uninterested in taking care of her domain. Barigal, with fire in her eyes and rage in her voice, reprimanded the sixth world goddess, displeased with her absence and actions. She asked if it was necessary to summon her to them, clearly not wanting to see her now. At that moment, a figure dressed in brightly colored robes appeared in the hall, her gaze focused and determined. She, with a slight chuckle on her lips, noticed that Barigal did not lack boldness and daring. It was the goddess Dwyrus, the deity of the sixth world. Sazakurain, without hiding her smirk, stated that she had already summoned Dwyrus, and the latter had arrived at her request. Dwyrus approached them confidently, her posture radiating strength and power. Goddess Eclipse, with her penetrating and icy gaze, ordered Dwyrus to explain herself to the assembled crowd. Dwyrus, as if immersed in memories, began to tell her story. She recalled the time when she was the goddess of the sixth world, and how the legendary beast had cornered her, destroying her soul. Dwyrus recounted how she returned to Earth afterwards to fight the beast, but the beast drove their army back. At that point she was seriously wounded and could barely stay on her feet. She explained that despite her grave condition, she could have destroyed the soul of the beast, but the goddess chose only to seal it, leaving it a chance for rebirth. A murmur went up in the hall, the goddesses shouting that Dwyrus was on the verge of death and that was why she had to do this. Dwyrus, in turn, with rage in her voice, shouted that she, the one called the goddess of war, could not have died from such scratches. Her anger was evident, and everyone listened silently as she screamed, realizing her strength and determination. Dwyrus continued her speech, stating that the seal placed on the beast was not complete, and very soon, the legendary beast might be reborn. She stated that she therefore intended to seize the forces of destruction and rebirth to finally break the seal. Her goal was to bring back the beast, complete what she had started, and finally destroy it. Everyone in the room was stunned by her words, their looks expressing a mixture of bewilderment and concern. Dwyrus, with determination in her voice, declared that when the beast returned, she would come down to earth again and finish it off once and for all. Barigal, with her penetrating gaze and voice full of determination, declared that Dwyrus was only a deity of that world, and it was not for her to decide the fate of the worlds now. She emphasized that Dwyrus would not be able to fully use her divine powers on Earth, and reminded her not to make the same mistake again. Barigal's words sounded like a warning and a challenge at the same time, her voice reflecting a concern for maintaining balance and order in the worlds. Dwyrus, clenching her fists and glaring at her fellow goddesses, whispered quietly that things would have been different if it weren't for the intervention of the one woman she called a child with an alien name. Anger and determination flashed in her eyes, reminding everyone of her past defeat and her desire to right her wrongs. Saisei, with a slight smile on her lips, remarked that Dwyrus had already lost once to the legendary beast, and even she couldn't predict what would happen this time. Her words sounded like a challenge and a reminder of the past, filling the atmosphere of the hall with tension. Dwyrus, without hiding her determination, declared that if she succeeded in getting rid of the beast once and for all, she would promise to return to her duties and take them seriously. Saisei, looking at her confidently, asked if she was sure of her strength and readiness. Dwyrus, without flinching, replied that of course she could do it. Saisei, weighing her words, said that she agreed to her proposal, but made a condition: if Dwyrus lost, her world would be irrevocably wiped out. These words caused shock and dismay among the other goddesses. At that moment, the goddess Axe Lion approached Saisei. She gently but insistently reminded her that removing one of the worlds would upset the balance in all the other universes. Her words sounded like a plea for reason and caution. Saisei, with cold calmness, replied that it was better to destroy a world than to give it to a beast. However, Axe Lion did not give up and asked Saisei to listen to the other goddesses before making such a decision. Dwyrus, striking her axe on the floor with such force that the sound echoed throughout the hall, declared that she would not fail. Her voice full of determination and anger, she ordered the goddesses to watch her from their chairs. The goddesses, in turn, shouted indignantly, demanding that she watch her tongue and show more respect. Saisei finally agreed. She ordered Dwyrus to report all oddities and changes as soon as she noticed them. Dwyrus, expressing understanding, began to back away, her footsteps sounding confident and determined. Saisei, sitting in her chair and watching Dwyrus walk away, smiled. Questions and premonitions swarmed in her thoughts. She knew the lot had been cast and was filled with curiosity as to what would happen next. At this time, Bernard's group was driving their carriage along winding roads surrounded by dense forests and flowering meadows. The horses, sensing the approach of the city, quickened their pace, and the scent of fresh leaves and flowers wafted through the air. Suddenly Bernard, who was sitting in the front seat, turned to the others and announced with a smile that they had already arrived. Before them spread the verdant city of Cambion, an oasis of magic and nature where every building, every street was imbued with magic. In the middle of the city stood a huge tree, its branches pointing up into the sky like giant arms embracing the clouds. Elsa, mesmerized by the sight, asked what kind of tree it was. Bernard, with a note of pride and respect in his voice, explained that it was the tree of the spirits, sacred and ancient, being the heart of Cambion. Elsa, amazed at what she had heard, asked what made this tree so special. Bernard, sighing and feeling like a mentor, explained that the tree was imbued with a magical energy that permeated it from root to tip. He added that all the land in Cambion was saturated with magic, and because of this, a unique ecosystem had formed here. The city was a living, breathing organism where nature and magic coexisted in perfect harmony. Vanessa, with professional interest, noted that the branches and leaves of this tree could be used as magical materials. She enthusiastically told me that each leaf was worth 10,000 gardas and a twig was worth up to 100,000 gardas. But if the root could be obtained, its price could reach 1,000,000 gards. Rolf, hearing such figures, was amazed. He realized how valuable this city and its resources were. The carriage continued driving through the streets, past rainbow-colored houses and shops full of rare goods and artifacts. Rolf sat in the carriage, pondering how many more unknown secrets and mysteries this world held. He gratefully recalled the moment he had joined Mr. Bernard's group, realizing that it had been one of the best decisions of his life. Traveling with Bernard and the rest of the group opened up worlds to him that he had never dreamed of before. These new, amazing places inspired him and awakened his thirst for knowledge and adventure. When the carriage stopped and they stepped outside, Bernard, with a businesslike look and confidence in his voice, announced that Rolf had an important assignment. He was to buy as many old things and weapons as possible. Rolf, ready for any assignment, took the task seriously, knowing that it was not just a purchase, but part of a larger plan to strengthen their group and prepare them for the coming trials. Vanessa, with a fire in her eyes, announced that she and Bernard would be traveling to the guild to turn in the delivery request and find a new assignment. Her gaze expressed determination and the smirk on her lips foreshadowed new exploits. She added that she would try to choose a monster-destroying assignment. Vanessa, with a mischievous sparkle in her eyes and a sly smirk on her lips, remarked that they needed to continue their intense training. Her tone was half-joking, but there was an iron determination in it. Elsa, realizing the seriousness of her friend's words, nodded with a sense of responsibility. Her eyes were filled with readiness for the upcoming trials and a desire to become stronger. Rolf, remembering the previous training, smiled and remarked with a slight sneer that when it comes to exercise, Vanessa turns into a real demon. Bernard, watching his team with a fatherly expression on his face, stated that after all the shopping and business, they could relax and enjoy the beauty of the city. His voice sounded calm and confident. He had confidence in his charges and knew they deserved a holiday. He suggested that they explore the city, immerse themselves in its atmosphere and learn more about its history and culture. Rolf and Elsa exchanged joyful glances and nodded in agreement. As they approached the shop, Rolf felt a sense of déjà vu. Everything was starting all over again, but this time he was ready for new discoveries. Elsa, noticing his thoughtfulness, suggested that he go shopping in search of good goods, and Rolf, grateful for her initiative, nodded his support. She asked if old things were needed again, and Rolf confirmed that the more they could find, the better. He pointed out that the town was large, so there must be a lot of things. They decided to start in the main street where there were the most shops and shops. As they strolled down the street, they were enjoying the sights and sounds of the town when suddenly their sense of smell caught an appetizing aroma. Risi, the faithful companion, barked loudly, emphasizing his approval. Elsa remembered that she had recently seen a shop selling meat smoked on splinters of the spirit tree, and suggested they try it. Rolf, unable to resist the temptation, happily agreed. They walked down the street, enjoying the atmosphere and conversation. Rolf suddenly realized that it would be just the two of them, and the thought flashed through his mind that it might be like a date. This made him slightly nervous, but he tried not to give away his emotions. Suddenly their attention was caught by a crowd of people and a noise coming from nearby. A hooded man suddenly rushed past Rolf, and he instinctively jumped back, feeling his heart beat faster. The only thing he had time to notice were the ears peeking out from under the hood, which left no doubt it could be a beast man. A surge of adrenaline clouded all thoughts for a moment, but a quick realization of reality brought him back to reality. The soldiers surrounding the hooded girl began to anxiously glance around and loudly discuss the situation. One of them loudly announced that the girl was lost in the crowd and they needed to find her immediately. They looked around nervously, trying to discover any trace of her. Rolf, hearing these words, turned to Elsa, raising an eyebrow questioningly, and asked what was wrong. Elsa, watching carefully, noticed that the soldiers were obviously looking for the same beastman girl they had just seen. After that they decided to continue their journey and headed towards a shop selling meat smoked on splinters of the spirit tree. Once inside, they were enveloped by the marvelous aroma of smoking, which whetted the appetite and gave a special atmosphere to the place. They sat down at a small wooden table and plates of succulent meat were placed in front of them, exuding a tantalizing odor. As they began to eat, Ralph and Elsa were amazed at the flavor. The meat melted in their mouths and the aroma of wood smoke gave it a special zest. Every bite reminded them of the magical power of the spirit tree, its ancient roots and history steeped in magic and legends. They savored every moment, forgetting for a while all worries. However, their peaceful pastime was disturbed by whispering at a neighboring table. People were talking excitedly about the appearance of the monster in the forest. Their conversations were getting louder and louder, and Ralph couldn't help but take notice. They were saying that this was the 15th monster this year, which added alarm to their voices. Ralph, hearing this, leaned over to Elsa and reminded her that Vanessa had talked about finding a task to eliminate monsters. He realized that this might be their chance to prove themselves. Determined to find out more, he approached the people who were discussing the monster and asked them to elaborate. The people, at first wary of him, quickly softened when Elsa explained that they were adventurers. They began to tell that about 5 years ago, the town was ruled by the powerful Plater family. This family had settled near the spirit tree and would let no one near its resources in an effort to control the magical power emanating from the tree. People said that the Plater family members used the leaves of the spirit tree when hunting monsters, which made them stronger and more dangerous. However, if a monster ate these leaves, it would become much more powerful, which turned the hunt into a deadly game. The people of the town claimed that because of this activity, monsters began to attack the town from the forest on a regular basis. Each year, the attacks became more frequent and more devastating, and the people lived in constant fear. The Adventurers Guild often received requests to collect branches and leaves of the spirit tree to counter the monsters. The man added that no one was currently mining the leaves and twigs of the spirit tree. His interlocutor explained that there are rumors. The Plater family is organizing attacks on the city under the guise of monster attacks. They are said to be kidnapping people and sending them to some mysterious camp. The other man quickly covered his mouth, warning him not to say it out loud. Rolf, interested, asked again about the camp, but at that moment the man with the black beard approached them and urged everyone to stop talking. The man with the beard explained that if they were overheard, they could be in the camp immediately. He placed several glasses on the table and looked back as he saw the guards approaching. Rolf looked closely at the guards and realized that he had seen this crest before. The man explained that the cursed tree was causing all the trouble. He then suggested that they stop talking and better have a drink to take their minds off the troubling thoughts. Elsa, observing the situation, remarked that there were many problems in the town, and Rolf agreed with her. Evening twilight had descended on the town as Rolf finished loading the last of the crates into the carriage. He felt relieved that he had finally finished this tedious job. At that moment, Elsa, who was standing nearby, suddenly shouted joyfully that Vanessa and Bernard had returned. Rolf, slightly tired but satisfied, nodded and locked the warehouse, making sure everything was securely closed. A little later, inside their cozy temporary shelter, the table was already set. The pleasant aromas of food filled the room, creating a homely atmosphere. Rolf, eagerly awaiting the news, asked Bernard what they had seen and if they had learned anything interesting. Bernard, frowning his eyebrows, admitted that although they had found nothing concrete, they had heard many unpleasant rumors. Vanessa, arranging the dishes on the table, suggested that they put the conversation aside and concentrate on dinner. She said she had prepared something special and encouraged everyone to enjoy the meal. Bernard agreed and everyone began the meal. Suddenly he tensed, his ears alert, as if he had picked up a barely audible sound. He asked everyone to be quiet and stated that he thought there was someone outside. The group became wary and the atmosphere became tense. Bernard and Rolf, keeping their weapons at the ready, went outside and began to scrutinize their surroundings, their eyes peering into the shadows and every corner. But in spite of their vigilance, no one could be detected. Bernard, somewhat relaxed, asked Rolf if it was possible that they had only imagined it, when suddenly Elsa's anxious voice came from the house, calling for them to return immediately. They rushed back, their hearts pounding with alarm. As they ran up, they saw Elsa, who was trembling with excitement and, pointing to the warehouse door, said that she thought someone had broken in. Rolf frowned, certain that he had locked the warehouse, and suggested that it might be ordinary mice. But his confidence shook slightly when he noticed how serious and anxious Elsa looked. Deciding to check it out, they slowly and cautiously opened the warehouse door. In the dim light of the oil lamp, they saw Reese, their faithful wolf cub, scampering between the crates. Suddenly he stopped at one of the crates and began barking loudly, his barking echoing through the warehouse, filling the space with disturbing sounds. Bernard and Rolf glanced over, exchanging wary glances. Rolf, with his hand clenched on the hilt of his sword, cautiously approached the crate in which Riese had obviously discovered something. With a slight creak, he opened the lid and froze in surprise. Before his eyes appeared a picture he had in no way expected to see. In the box, curled up on a pile of soft rags, a little beast girl was sleeping peacefully. Her ears fluttered faintly, and her breathing was even and quiet. The girl was sleeping sweetly on the bed, her breathing even and calm. Elsa walked over to her, sat down on the edge of the bed, and noticed how soundly she was sleeping. Rolf, standing nearby, wondered who this girl was and how she had ended up in their warehouse. Elsa, frowning, wondered how she could have got in. Bernard, who was sitting by the window, suggested that the girl had probably snuck in through the window, since it was large enough for a child to fit through. Vanessa, who had been watching the girl thoughtfully, asked Bernard what they would do next. Bernard, sighing, offered to solve the problem in the morning, adding that he would have to report her to the guild anyway. At that moment, Riese, their faithful wolf cub, ran up to the girl and licked her cheek with his warm tongue. The girl felt it, woke up, and when she saw the doggy, she was happy. However, her joy was quickly replaced by anxiety when she noticed the people surrounding her. She instinctively growled at them, fearfully showing her small fangs. Rolf, trying not to startle her, told her in a soft voice not to worry and assured her that they wouldn't hurt her. He tried to find out where she had come from and what had happened to her, but the girl continued to growl, her eyes expressing disbelief and fear. Elsa, looking into her face, noticed that one of her hands was covered with dried blood. She carefully reached out and took the girl's small palm in her fingers, trying not to frighten her. Vanessa, seeing this, moved closer and gently but firmly ordered the girl to let her look at the wound. The girl, still wary, reluctantly held out her hand. Vanessa carefully turned her palm around and saw the deep but not fatal wound, which, however, could become inflamed if left untreated. Vanessa closed her eyes and concentrated, her staff glowing with a soft light. The healing spell began to take effect and the light enveloped the wound, slowly tightening it. Vanessa watched with a smile as the girl's skin became smooth and healthy again. She gently stroked her face and asked if she was feeling better. The girl, who had kept her eyes on Vanessa all this time, looked at her hand in surprise. When she saw that the wound was gone, she smiled broadly, her eyes lighting up with gratitude. Vanessa leaned over to the girl and remarked that despite her wounds being healed, she needed to take a bath to finally clean herself up. The girl asked fearfully if it would hurt. Vanessa gently shook her head, assuring her that it would be fine. After a while, Rolf approached Bernard, who was standing turned away, and asked him if he had found everything he was looking for. Rolf answered in the affirmative, saying that he had found baby things in the warehouse. He noticed that Bernard looked worried and inquired what was wrong. Bernard admitted that he had a bad feeling. Vanessa, with concern in her voice, shouted to Bernard from the bathroom to come to them immediately. Bernard sighed irritably, but still headed for the bathroom to find out what happened this time. After taking a shower and feeling a little better, he still couldn't get rid of the feeling that it was all for a reason. When he returned, Vanessa was already braiding the girl's long, wet hair, and Riese was snuggled up on her lap. Vanessa, smiling, noticed that Riese seemed to have found a new friend in the girl. Rolf, watching this, suddenly remembered where he had seen this girl. He exclaimed sharply as he realized that this was the same girl they had encountered in the afternoon in town. Elsa, startled by this discovery, recalled that the guards had pursued her. Bernard, hearing this, was dumbfounded and looked at the girl with even more interest. She lowered her head, apparently realizing that she would now have to explain herself. Bernard persistently asked what she had done to deserve such a chase. Rolf, with a softness in his voice, reassured her, assuring her that if she told the truth, they would surely find a way to help her. At this point, her stomach began to make loud rumbling noises, and everyone looked at each other in surprise. Elsa, realizing that the girl was obviously hungry, asked Rolf to heat up the soup that was left over from dinner. Rolf readily went to the kitchen, and soon the aroma of warm soup filled the room. After a while, the girl was already enjoying her dinner. She ate with such greediness, as if she had not seen food for a long time. Elsa, observing this, gently asked her to take her time, assuring her that no one would take her food away from her. The girl looked at her in surprise, unaccustomed to such attentiveness. Gradually her hunger was quenched, and the girl's eyes began to close from fatigue. She fell asleep right at the table, exhausted and satiated. Rolf, with care and tenderness, took her in his arms and carried her into the room where they prepared a place for her to sleep. Bernard, observing this, suggested that they question the girl further when she woke up to see what was going on and how they should proceed. In the evening, when everyone had settled down, Elsa lay in bed with the girl snuggled up next to her. Elsa looked at Rolf and suggested that he lie down with them. However, Rolf smiled and settled down on the floor, laying down a blanket for himself, and called Risi to him. He joked that they had enough blankets for everyone. Instead of going to Rolf, however, Risi went to Elsa and snuggled at her feet. Rolf smiled at Risi's cruelty, but he couldn't help but admit that Elsa's place was indeed cozier. Rolf walked slowly over to the lamp, carefully stepping around the things scattered around the room, and reaching for the switch, quietly told Elsa that he was going to switch off the light. At that moment, he noticed that her attention had been diverted by something else. He looked in the same direction and saw their faithful wolf cub, Risi, slowly walk over to the sleeping girl and lay down beside her. Small droplets of tears glistened on her cheeks, quietly rolling down her face as if reflecting her suffering and worry. Elsa, seeing this, quietly leaned over to the girl and gently wiped away her tears, trying not to wake her up. The thought flashed through her mind of how much pain and fear this little girl had to go through to have tears even in her sleep. She stroked her head as if trying to convey all her care and warmth. Looking at this touching moment, Rolf suddenly sank into his own memories. He recalled how after his parents disappeared, he also couldn't sleep well at night. Each closing of his eyes brought images of possible tragedies that might have befallen his relatives. Then his grandmother, wise and kind, was always there, sitting by his bedside until he fell asleep. Now, looking at the sleeping girl, he felt those memories intertwined with reality. He approached her, quietly and carefully, as if afraid to disturb her peace. He stroked her head, just as his grandmother had done, and quietly told her not to worry. He promised her that she was not alone now, that they would be together, and he would protect her from all harm. But the girl continued to sleep. Her breathing was even and calm. Elsa, who was lying on the bed, suggested to Rolf to lie down with them once more. Rolf noticed that 3 people on the bed would be cramped, but Elsa, smiling, said that it was all right, and that Risi would move over to make room for everyone. Risi, as if understanding her words, just barked back, confirming her confidence. Rolf woke up to a quiet but insistent sound. Barely opening his eyes, he saw the little girl playing with Risi. The wolf cub was wagging his tail happily, and the little girl was smiling, telling him how good he was. Rolf reached out and finally waking up, told her that the wolf cub's name was Risi. He introduced himself and introduced Elsa, who was just waking up. The girl, still a little wary, asked Risi if these people were good, and Risi barked happily, as if confirming that they could be trusted. The girl relaxed and finally said that in that case she too would tell them her name. She introduced herself as Nagunya. Elsa and Rolf exchanged glances that read relief and joy. Then Elsa, smiling gently, suggested that Nagunya go to breakfast, but first wash and change her clothes. After a while, everyone gathered around the table, enjoying their breakfast. Rolf, looking thoughtfully at his plate, turned to Bernard and quietly announced that the girl had given her name. Bernard looked up with interest, nodded and continued eating, pondering what he had heard. When they finished breakfast and went outside, Rolf introduced Bernard and Vanessa to Nagunya. The girl smiled shyly and said quietly that she would remember their names. Bernard, looking at her carefully, asked what had happened to her. The girl's face darkened, she sank down, and her eyes filled with pain. Noticing this, everyone froze, waiting for her words. Nagunya, taking a deep breath, said that she did not want to remember what had happened to her. The gazes of all present were fixed on her, and they felt the weight of her memories. Nagunya added that she felt that there were good people in front of her, and that is why she believed that they would be able to help her. Then, gathering her wits, the girl shouted sharply at Rolf, asking him to bring paper and a quill. Rolf, though a little surprised at her abruptness, quickly complied with the request, returning a few minutes later with the needed items. Nagunya began to draw on the paper she had brought, and what came out from under her pen resembled a map. Bernard, looking at the drawing, thought for a moment that he was seeing a divine language, but soon realized that it was more of a local dialect. Rolf, noticing the unusual symbols, asked Bernard if it was a divine language, but Bernard explained that it was slightly different. Nagunya continued to draw, her movements quick and sure, as if she was trying to capture every detail. She told me that she had been taken under a tree. She pointed with her eyes to a huge tree towering in the center of the city. Rolf, hearing this, was amazed and interested, for it was a tree of spirits. He asked what they were doing under the tree, and Nagunya began her sad story. She said that they were forced to work in the mine under the tree. Nagunya began her story, her voice trembling with memories. She narrated how they lived under constant fear and threat. Evil men, ruthless and cruel, beat them every day. These blows not only caused physical pain but also destroyed their spirit, turning their lives into an endless nightmare. Nagunya said that they were forced to endure humiliation and suffering, with no hope of escape. Apart from the beatings, they were constantly starving. The bad people gave them so little food that their stomachs were constantly cramped with hunger. Every crumb was worth its weight in gold, and they learned to appreciate every grain they could get. Hunger became their constant companion, aggravating their suffering and robbing them of their strength. The girl continued the story, recalling how they were kept in a cage like animals. The iron bars restricted their freedom, leaving no hope of escape. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, men in black cloaks would come and take one of them away. No one knew what happened to these unfortunates, but none of them ever came back. The fear of the unknown hung over them like a dark cloud. But one day the other captives decided to help her. They realized that someone must call for help or they would all perish. Under the cover of night, when the guards let their guard down, they helped Nagunya out of the cage. It was a night full of fear and despair, but she was able to escape. The girl ran through the forest, not knowing what lay ahead, but believing that a better life awaited her in freedom. However, her freedom was short-lived. Bad men discovered her trail and began to pursue her. She ran, exhausted and scared, but knew she couldn't stop. Her little heart beat like never before as she hid from her pursuers. But even in this terror she did not give up, continuing to search for a way to escape. Suddenly, among the trees, she saw their carriage. It was her last hope. She found shelter in their carriage and was finally able to feel safe. For the first time in a long time she felt that someone could protect her. Everyone listened to her story with bated breath, realizing the depth of her suffering. Rolf listened intently to every word she said, and gradually a picture formed in his mind of the horror that lurked behind the walls of the mine under the spirit tree. He realized that all the rumors they had heard earlier were true,